Chapter 1 of The People That Time Forgot. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The People That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 1. I am forced to admit that even though I had traveled a long distance to place Bowen Tyler's manuscript in the hands of his father, I was still a trifle skeptical as to its sincerity, since I could not but recall that it had not been many years since Bowen had been one of the most notorious practical jokers of his alma mater. The truth was that as I sat in the Tyler library at Santa Monica, I commenced to feel a trifle foolish, and to wish that I had merely forwarded the manuscript by express instead of bearing it personally, for I confess that I do not enjoy being laughed at. I have a well-developed sense of humor, when the joke is not on me. Mr. Tyler Sr. was expected almost hourly. The last steamer in from Honolulu had brought information of the date of the expected sailing of his yacht Toreador, which was now 24 hours overdue. Mr. Tyler's assistant secretary, who had been left at home, assured me that there was no doubt but that the Toreador had sailed as promised, since he knew his employer well enough to be positive that nothing short of an act of God would prevent his doing what he had planned to do. I was also aware of the fact that the sending apparatus of the Toreador's wireless equipment was sealed, and that it would only be used in event of dire necessity. There was therefore nothing to do but wait, and we waited. We discussed the manuscript and hazarded guesses concerning it and the strange events it narrated. The torpedoing of the liner upon which Bowen J. Tyler, Jr. had taken passage for France to join the American ambulance was a well-known fact, and I had further substantiated by wire to the New York office of the owners that a Miss La Rue had been booked for passage. Further, neither she nor Bowen had been mentioned among the list of survivors, nor had the body of either of them been recovered. Their rescue by the English tug was entirely probable. The capture of the enemy U-33 by the tug's crew was not beyond the range of possibility, and their adventures during the perilous cruise which the treachery and deceit of Benson extended until they found themselves in the waters of the far South Pacific with depleted stores and poisoned water casks, while bordering upon the fantastic, appeared logical enough as narrated, event by event, in the manuscript. Caprona has always been considered a more or less mythical land, though it is vouched for by an eminent navigator of the 18th century. But Bowen's narrative made it seem very real, however many miles of trackless ocean lay between us and it. Yes, the narrative had us guessing. We were agreed that it was most improbable, but neither of us could say that anything which it contained was beyond the range of possibility. The weird flora and fauna of Caspak were as possible under the thick, warm atmospheric conditions of the superheated crater as they were in the Mesozoic era under almost exactly similar conditions, which were then probably worldwide. The assistant secretary had heard of Caproni and his discoveries, but admitted that he never had taken much stock in the one nor the other. We were agreed that the one statement most difficult of explanation was that which reported the entire absence of human young among the various tribes which Tyler had had intercourse. This was the one irreconcilable statement of the manuscript. A world of adults? It was impossible. We speculated upon the probable fate of Bradley and his party of English sailors. Tyler had found the graves of 2 of them. How many more might have perished? And Miss La Rue? Could a young girl long have survived the horrors of Caspak after having been separated from all of her own kind? The assistant secretary wondered if Nobs still was with her, and then we both smiled at this tacit acceptance of the truth of the whole uncanny tale. "I suppose I'm a fool," remarked the assistant secretary, "but by George, I can't help believing it. And I can see that girl now, with the big Airedale at her side, protecting her from the terrors of a million years ago. I can visualize the entire scene, the ape-like Grimaldi men huddled in their filthy caves, the huge pterodactyls soaring through the heavy air upon their bat-like wings, the mighty dinosaurs moving their clumsy hulks beneath the dark shadows of preglacial forests, the dragons which we considered myths until science taught us that they were the true recollections of the first man, handed down through countless ages by word of mouth from father to son out of the unrecorded dawn of humanity. "It is stupendous, if true," I replied. "And to think that possibly they are still there, Tyler and Miss La Rue, surrounded by hideous dangers, and that possibly Bradley still lives, and some of his party. I can't help hoping all the time that Bowen and the girl have found the others. The last Bowen knew of them, there were 6 left, all told: the mate Bradley, the engineer Olson and Wilson, Whitely, Brady, and Sinclair. There might be some hope for them if they could join forces, but separated, I'm afraid they couldn't last long. If only they hadn't let the German prisoners capture the U-33. Bowen should have had better judgment than to have trusted them at all. The chances are von Schoenvorts succeeded in getting safely back to Kiel, and is strutting around with an iron cross this very minute. With a large supply of oil from the wells they discovered in Caspak, with plenty of water and ample provisions, there is no reason why they couldn't have negotiated the submerged tunnel beneath the barrier cliffs and made good their escape." "I don't like 'em," said the assistant secretary, "but sometimes you got to hand it to 'em." "Yes," I growled, "and there's nothing I'd enjoy more than handing it to them." And then the telephone rang. The assistant secretary answered, and as I watched him, I saw his jaw drop and his face go white. "No, no!" he exclaimed as he hung up the receiver as one in a trance. "It can't be." "What?" I asked. "Mr. Tyler is dead," he answered in a dull voice. "He died at sea, suddenly, yesterday." The next 10 days were occupied in burying Mr. Bowen J. Tyler, Sr., and arranging plans for the succor of his son. Mr. Tom Billings, the late Mr. Tyler's secretary, did it all. He is force, energy, initiative, and good judgment combined and personified. I never have beheld a more dynamic young man. He handled lawyers, courts, and executors as a sculptor handles his modeling clay. He formed, fashioned, and forced them to his will. He had been a classmate of Bowen Tyler at college, and a fraternity brother, and before that he had been an impoverished and improvident cowpuncher on one of the great Tyler ranches. Tyler, Sr., had picked him out of thousands of employees and made him, or rather Tyler had given him the opportunity, and then Billings had made himself. Tyler, Jr., as good a judge of men as his father, had taken him into his friendship, and between the two of them they had turned out a man who would have died for Tyler as quickly as he would have for his flag. Yet there was none of the sycophant or fawner in Billings. Ordinarily I do not wax enthusiastic about men, but this man Billings comes as close to my conception of what a regular man should be as any I have ever met. I venture to say that before Bowen J. Tyler sent him to college he had never heard the word ethics, and yet I am equally sure that in all his life he never has transgressed a single tenet of the code of ethics of an American gentleman. 10 days after they brought Mr. Tyler's body off the Toreador, we steamed out into the Pacific in search of Caprona. There were 40 in the party, including the master and crew of the Toreador, and Billings the indomitable was in command. We had a long and uninteresting search for Caprona, for the old map upon which the assistant secretary had finally located it was most inaccurate. When its grim walls finally rose out of the ocean's mists before us, we were so far south that it was a question as to whether we were in the South Pacific or the Antarctic. Bergs were numerous, and it was very cold. All during the trip, Billings had steadfastly evaded questions as to how we were to enter Caspak after we had found Caprona. Bowen Tyler's manuscript had made it perfectly evident to all that the subterranean outlet of the Caspakian River was the only means of ingress or egress to the crater world beyond the impregnable cliffs. Tyler's party had been able to navigate this channel because their craft had been a submarine, but the Toreador could as easily have flown over the cliffs as sailed under them. Jimmy Hollis and Colin Short whiled away many an hour inventing schemes for surmounting the obstacle presented by the barrier cliffs, and making ridiculous wagers as to which one Tom Billings had in mind. But immediately we were all assured that we had raised Caprona, Billings called us together. There was no use in talking about these things, he said, until we found the island. At best it can be but conjecture on our part until we have been able to scrutinize the coast closely. Each of us has formed a mental picture of the Capronian seacoast from Bowen's manuscript, and it is not likely that any two of these pictures resemble each other, or that any of them resemble the coast as we shall presently find it. I have in view three plans for scaling the cliffs, and the means for carrying out each is in the hold. There is an electric drill with plenty of waterproof cable to reach from the ship's dynamos to the cliff top when the Toreador is anchored at a safe distance from shore, and there is sufficient half-inch iron rod to build a ladder from the base to the top of the cliff. It would be a long, arduous, and dangerous work to bore the holes and insert the rungs of the ladder from the bottom upward, yet it can be done. I also have a life-saving mortar with which we might be able to throw a line over the summit of the cliffs, but this plan would necessitate one of us climbing to the top, with the chances more than even that the line would cut at the summit, or the hooks at the upper end would slip. My third plan seems to me the most feasible. You all saw a number of large, heavy boxes lowered into the hold before we sailed. I know you did, because you asked me what they contained and commented upon the large letter H, which was painted upon each box. These boxes contain the various parts of a hydro-aeroplane. I propose assembling this upon the strip of beach described in Bowen's manuscript, the beach where he found the dead body of the ape-like man, provided there is sufficient space above high water. Otherwise we shall have to assemble it on deck and lower it over the side. After it is assembled, I shall carry tackle and ropes to the cliff top, and then it will be comparatively simple to hoist the search party and its supplies in safety. Or I can make a sufficient number of trips to land the entire party in the valley beyond the barrier. All will depend, of course, upon what my first reconnaissance reveals. That afternoon we steamed slowly along the face of Caprona's towering barrier. "You see now," remarked Billings as we craned our necks to scan the summit thousands of feet above us, "how futile it would have been to waste our time in working out details of a plan to surmount those," and he jerked his thumb toward the cliffs. "It would take weeks, possibly months, to construct a ladder to the top. I had no conception of their formidable height. Our mortar would not carry a line halfway to the crest of the lowest point. There is no use discussing any plan other than the hydro-aeroplane. We'll find the beach and get busy." Late the following morning the lookout announced that he could discern surf about a mile ahead, and as we approached we all saw the line of breakers broken by a long sweep of rolling surf upon a narrow beach. The launch was lowered, and 5 of us made a landing, getting a good ducking in the ice-cold waters in the doing of it. But we were rewarded by the finding of the clean-picked bones of what might have been the skeleton of a high order of ape or a very low order of man, lying close to the base of the cliff. Billings was satisfied, as were the rest of us, that this was the beach mentioned by Bowen, and we further found that there was ample room to assemble the seaplane. Billings, having arrived at a decision, lost no time in acting, with the result that before mid-afternoon we had landed all the large boxes marked H upon the beach, and were busily engaged in opening them. 2 days later the plane was assembled and tuned. We loaded tackles and ropes, water, food, and ammunition in it, and then we each implored Billings to let us be the one to accompany him. But he would take no one. That was Billings. If there was any especially difficult or dangerous work to be done that one man could do, Billings always did it himself. If he needed assistance, he never called for volunteers, just selected the man or men he considered best qualified for the duty. He said that he considered the principles underlying all volunteer service fundamentally wrong, and that it seemed to him that calling for volunteers reflected upon the courage and loyalty of the entire command. We rowed the plane down to the water's edge, and Billings mounted the pilot's seat. There was a moment's delay, as he assured himself that he had everything necessary. Jimmy Hollis went over his armament and ammunition to see that nothing had been omitted. Besides pistol and rifle, there was the machine gun mounted in front of him on the plane, and ammunition for all three. Bowen's account of the terrors of Caspak had impressed us all with the necessity for proper means of defense. At last all was ready. The motor was started, and we pushed the plane out into the surf. A moment later, and she was skimming seaward. Gently she rose from the surface of the water, executed a wide spiral as she mounted rapidly, circled once far above us, and then disappeared over the crest of the cliffs. We all stood silent and expectant, our eyes glued upon the towering summit above us. Hollis, who was now in command, consulted his wrist watch at frequent intervals. "Gad!" exclaimed Short. "We ought to be hearing from him pretty soon." Hollis laughed nervously. "He's been gone only 10 minutes," he announced. "Seems like an hour," snapped Short. "What's that?" "Did you hear that? He's firing. It's the machine gun. Oh, Lord! And here we are, as helpless as a lot of old ladies 10,000 miles away. We can't do a thing. We don't know what's happening. Why didn't he let one of us go with him?" Yes, it was the machine gun. We could hear it distinctly for at least a minute. Then came silence. That was 2 weeks ago. We have had no sign nor signal from Tom Billings since. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The People That Time Forgot. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The People That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 2. I'll never forget my first impressions of Caspak as I circled in, high over the surrounding cliffs. From the plane I looked down through a mist upon the blurred landscape beneath me. The hot, humid atmosphere of Caspak condenses as it is fanned by the cold Antarctic air currents which sweep across the crater's top, sending a tenuous ribbon of vapor far out across the Pacific. Through this the picture gave one the suggestion of a colossal impressionistic canvas in greens and browns and scarlets and yellows surrounding the deep blue of the inland sea, just blobs of color taking form through the tumbling mist. I dived close to the cliffs and skirted them for several miles without finding the least indication of a suitable landing place, and then I swung back at a lower level, looking for a clearing close to the bottom of the mighty escarpment, but I could find none of sufficient area to ensure safety. I was flying pretty low by this time, not only looking for landing places, but watching the myriad life beneath me. I was down pretty well toward the south end of the island, where an arm of the lake reaches far inland, and I could see the surface of the water literally black with creatures of some sort. I was too far up to recognize individuals, but the general impression was of a vast army of amphibious monsters. The land was almost equally alive with crawling, leaping, running, flying things. It was one of the latter which nearly did for me while my attention was fixed upon the weird scene below. The first intimation I had of it was the sudden blotting out of the sunlight from above, and as I glanced quickly up, I saw a most terrific creature swooping down upon me. It must have been fully 80 feet long from the end of its long, hideous beak to the tip of its thick, short tail, with an equal spread of wings. It was coming straight for me and hissing frightfully. I could hear it above the whir of the propeller. It was coming straight down toward the muzzle of the machine gun, and I let it have it right in the breast, but still it came for me, so that I had to dive and turn, though I was dangerously close to earth. The thing didn't miss me by a dozen feet, and when I rose, it wheeled and followed me, but only to the cooler air close to the level of the cliff tops. There it turned again and dropped. Something, man's natural love of battle and the chase, I presume, impelled me to pursue it, and so I too circled and dived. The moment I came down into the warm atmosphere of Caspak, the creature came for me again, rising above me so that it might swoop down upon me. Nothing could better have suited my armament, since my machine gun was pointed upward at an angle of about 20 degrees and could not be either depressed or elevated by the pilot. If I had brought someone along with me, we could have raked the great reptile from almost any position, but as the creature's mode of attack was always from above, he always found me ready with a hail of bullets. The battle must have lasted a minute or more before the thing suddenly turned completely over in the air and fell to the ground. Bowen and I roomed together at college, and I learned a lot from him outside my regular course. He was a pretty good scholar despite his love of fun, and his particular hobby was paleontology. He used to tell me about the various forms of animal and vegetable life which had covered the globe during former eras, and so I was pretty well acquainted with the fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals of Paleolithic times. I knew that the thing that had attacked me was some sort of pterodactyl which should have been extinct millions of years ago. It was all that I needed to realize that Bowen had exaggerated nothing in his manuscript. Having disposed of my first foe, I set myself once more to search for a landing place near to the base of the cliffs beyond which my party awaited me. I knew how anxious they would be for word from me, and I was equally anxious to relieve their minds and also to get them and our supplies well within Caspak, so that we might set off about our business of finding and rescuing Bowen Tyler. But the pterodactyl's carcass had scarcely fallen before I was surrounded by at least a dozen of the hideous things, some large, some small, but all bent upon my destruction. I could not cope with them all, and so I rose rapidly from among them to the cooler strata wherein they dared not follow. And then I recalled that Bowen's narrative distinctly indicated that the farther north one traveled in Caspak, the fewer were the terrible reptiles which rendered human life impossible at the southern end of the island. There seemed nothing now but to search out a more northerly landing place, and then return to the Toreador and transport my companions two by two over the cliffs and deposit them at the rendezvous. As I flew north, the temptation to explore overcame me. I knew that I could easily cover Caspak and return to the beach with less petrol than I had in my tanks, and there was the hope, too, that I might find Bowen or some of his party. The broad expanse of the inland sea lured me out over its waters, and as I crossed, I saw at either extremity of the great body of water an island, one to the south and one to the north. But I did not alter my course to examine either closely, leaving that to a later time. The further shore of the sea revealed a much narrower strip of land between the cliffs and the water than upon the western side, but it was hillier and more open country. There were splendid landing places, and in the distance toward the north I thought I descried a village, but of that I was not positive. However, as I approached the land, I saw a number of human figures apparently pursuing one who fled across a broad expanse of meadow. As I dropped lower to have a better look at these people, they caught the whirring of my propellers and looked aloft. They paused an instant, pursuers and pursued, and then they broke and raced for the shelter of the nearest wood. Almost instantaneously a huge bulk swooped down upon me, and as I looked up, I realized that there were flying reptiles even in this part of Caspak. The creature dived for my right wing so quickly that nothing but a sheer drop could have saved me. I was already close to the ground, so that my maneuver was extremely dangerous, but I was in a fair way of making it successfully when I saw that I was too closely approaching a large tree. My effort to dodge the tree and the pterodactyl at the same time resulted disastrously. One wing touched an upper branch. The plane tipped and swung around, and then, out of control, dashed into the branches of the tree, where it came to rest, battered and torn, 40 feet above the ground. Hissing loudly, the huge reptile swept close above the tree in which my plane had lodged, circled twice over me, and then flapped away toward the south. As I guessed then, and was to learn later, forests are the surest sanctuary from these hideous creatures, which, with their enormous spread of wing and their great weight, are as much out of place among trees as is a seaplane. For a minute or so I clung there to my battered flyer, now useless beyond redemption, my brain numbed by the frightful catastrophe that had befallen me. All my plans for the succor of Bowen and Miss La Rue had depended upon this craft, and in a few minutes my own selfish love of adventure had wrecked their hopes and mine. And what effect it might have upon the future of the balance of the rescuing expedition I could not even guess. Their lives, too, might be sacrificed to my suicidal foolishness. That I was doomed seemed inevitable, but I can honestly say that the fate of my friends concerned me more greatly than did my own. Beyond the barrier cliffs my party was even now nervously awaiting my return. Presently apprehension and fear would claim them, and they would never know. They would attempt to scale the cliffs, of that I was sure, but I was not so positive that they would succeed, and after a while they would turn back, what there were left of them, and go sadly and mournfully upon their return journey to home. Home! I set my jaws and tried to forget the word, for I knew that I should never again see home. And what of Bowen and his girl? I had doomed them too. They would never even know that an attempt had been made to rescue them. If they still lived, they might some day come upon the ruined remnants of this great plain hanging in its lofty sepulchre, and hazard vain guesses and be filled with wonder. But they would never know, and I could not but be glad that they would not know that Tom Billings had sealed their death warrants by his criminal selfishness. All these useless regrets were getting me in a bad way. But at last I shook myself and tried to put such things out of my mind and take hold of conditions as they existed and do my level best to wrest victory from defeat. I was badly shaken up and bruised, but considered myself mighty lucky to escape with my life. The plane hung at a precarious angle, so that it was with difficulty and considerable danger that I climbed from it into the tree and then to the ground. My predicament was grave. Between me and my friends lay an inland sea fully 60 miles wide at this point, and an estimated land distance of some 300 miles around the northern end of the sea. Through such hideous dangers as I am perfectly free to admit had me pretty well buffaloed. I had seen quite enough of Caspak this day to assure me that Bowen had in no way exaggerated its perils. As a matter of fact, I am inclined to believe that he had become so accustomed to them before he started upon his manuscript that he rather slighted them. As I stood there beneath that tree, a tree which should have been part of a coal bed countless ages since, and looked out across a sea teeming with frightful life, life which should have been fossil before God conceived of Adam, I would not have given a minim of stale beer for my chances of ever seeing my friends or the outside world again. Yet then and there I swore to fight my way as far through this hideous land as circumstances would permit. I had plenty of ammunition, an automatic pistol and a heavy rifle, the latter one of 20, added to our equipment on the strength of Bowen's description of the huge beasts of prey which ravaged Caspak. My greatest danger lay in the hideous reptilia whose low nervous organizations permitted their carnivorous instincts to function for several minutes after they had ceased to live. But to these things I gave less thought than to the sudden frustration of all our plans. With the bitterest of thoughts I condemned myself for the foolish weakness that had permitted me to be drawn from the main object of my flight into premature and useless exploration. It seemed to me then that I must be totally eliminated from further search for Bowen, since, as I estimated it, the 300 miles of Caspakian territory I must traverse to reach the base of the cliffs, beyond which my party awaited me, were practically impassable for a single individual unaccustomed to Caspakian life and ignorant of all that lay before him. Yet I could not give up hope entirely. My duty lay clear before me. I must follow it while life remained to me, and so I set forth toward the north. The country through which I took my way was as lovely as it was unusual. I had almost said unearthly, for the plants, the trees, the blooms were not of the earth that I knew. They were larger, the colors more brilliant, and the shapes startling, some almost to grotesqueness, though even such added to the charm and romance of the landscape as the giant cacti render weirdly beautiful the waste spots of the sad Mojave. And over all the sun shone huge and round and red, a monster sun above a monstrous world, its light dispersed by the humid air of Caspak, the warm, moist air which lies sluggish upon the breast of this great mother of life, nature's mightiest incubator. All about me, in every direction, was life. It moved through the treetops and among the boles. It displayed itself in widening and intermingling circles upon the bosom of the sea. It leaped from the depths. I could hear it in a dense wood at my right, the murmur of it rising and falling in ceaseless volumes of sound, riven at intervals by a horrid scream or a thunderous roar which shook the earth. And always I was haunted by that inexplicable sensation that unseen eyes were watching me, that soundless feet dogged my trail. I am neither nervous nor high-strung, but the burden of responsibility upon me weighed heavily, so that I was more cautious than is my wont. I turned often to right and left and rear, lest I be surprised, and I carried my rifle at the ready in my hand. Once I could have sworn that among the many creatures dimly perceived amidst the shadows of the wood, I saw a human figure dart from one cover to another, but I could not be sure. For the most part I skirted the wood, making occasional detours rather than enter those forbidding depths of gloom, though many times I was forced to pass through arms of the forest which extended to the very shore of the inland sea. There was so sinister a suggestion in the uncouth sounds and the vague glimpses of moving things within the forest, of the menace of strange beasts and possibly still stranger men, that I always breathed more freely when I had passed once more into open country. I had traveled northward for perhaps an hour, still haunted by the conviction that I was being stalked by some creature which kept always hidden among the trees and shrubbery to my right and a little to my rear, when for the 100th time I was attracted by a sound from that direction, and turning saw some animal running rapidly through the forest toward me. There was no longer any effort on its part at concealment. It came on through the underbrush swiftly, and I was confident that whatever it was, it had finally gathered the courage to charge me boldly. Before it finally broke into plain view, I became aware that it was not alone, for a few yards in its rear a second thing thrashed through the leafy jungle. Evidently I was to be attacked in force by a pair of hunting beasts or men. And then through the last clump of waving ferns broke the figure of the foremost creature, which came leaping toward me on light feet as I stood with my rifle to my shoulder covering the point at which I had expected it would emerge. I must have looked foolish indeed if my surprise and consternation were in any way reflected upon my countenance as I lowered my rifle and gazed incredulous at the lithe figure of the girl speeding swiftly in my direction. But I did not have long to stand thus with lowered weapon, for as she came I saw her cast an affrighted glance over her shoulder, and at the same moment there broke from the jungle at the same spot at which I had seen her the hugest cat I had ever looked upon. At first I took the beast for a saber-toothed tiger. It was quite the most fearsome appearing beast one could imagine, but it was not that dread monster of the past, though quite formidable enough to satisfy the most fastidious thrill hunter. On it came, grim and terrible, its baleful eyes glaring above its distended jaws, its lips curled in a frightful snarl which exposed a whole mouthful of formidable teeth. At sight of me it had abandoned its impetuous rush and was now sneaking slowly toward us, while the girl, a long knife in her hand, took her stand bravely at my left and a little to my rear. She had called something to me in a strange tongue as she raced toward me, and now she spoke again, but what she said I could not then, of course, know, only that her tones were sweet, well modulated, and free from any suggestion of panic. Facing the huge cat which I now saw was an enormous panther, I waited until I could place a shot where I felt it would do the most good, for at best a frontal shot at any of the large carnivora is a ticklish matter. I had some advantage in that the beast was not charging. Its head was held low and its back exposed, and so at 40 yards I took careful aim at its spine at the junction of neck and shoulders. But at the same instant, as though sensing my intention, the great creature lifted its head and leaped forward in full charge. To fire at that sloping forehead I knew would be worse than useless, and so I quickly shifted my aim and pulled the trigger, hoping against hope that the soft-nosed bullet and the heavy charge of powder would have sufficient stopping effect to give me time to place a second shot. In answer to the report of the rifle, I had the satisfaction of seeing the brute spring into the air, turning a complete somersault; but it was up again almost instantly, though in the brief second that it took it to scramble to its feet and get its bearings, it exposed its left side fully toward me, and a second bullet went crashing through its heart. Down it went for the second time, and then up and at me. The vitality of these creatures of Caspak is one of the marvelous features of this strange world, and bespeaks the low, nervous organization of the old Paleolithic life which has been so long extinct in other portions of the world. I put a third bullet into the beast at 3 paces, and then I thought that I was done for, but it rolled over and stopped at my feet, stone dead. I found that my second bullet had torn its heart almost completely away, and yet it had lived to charge ferociously upon me, and but for my third shot would doubtless have slain me before it finally expired, or, as Bowen Tyler so quaintly put it, before it knew that it was dead. With the panther quite evidently conscious of the fact that dissolution had overtaken it, I turned toward the girl, who was regarding me with evident admiration and not a little awe, though I must admit that my rifle claimed quite as much of her attention as did I. She was quite the most wonderful animal that I have ever looked upon, and what few of her charms her apparel hid, it quite effectively succeeded in accentuating. A bit of soft undressed leather was caught over her left shoulder and beneath her right breast, falling upon her left side to her hip, and upon the right to a metal band which encircled her leg above the knee and to which the lowest point of the hide was attached. About her waist was a loose leather belt, to the center of which was attached the scabbard belonging to her knife. There was a single armlet between her right shoulder and elbow, and a series of them covered her left arm from elbow to wrist. These, I learned later, answered the purpose of a shield against knife attack when the left arm is raised in guard against the breast or face. Her masses of heavy hair were held in place by a broad metal band which bore a large triangular ornament directly in the center of her forehead. This ornament appeared to be a huge turquoise, while the metal of all her ornaments was beaten virgin gold, inlaid in intricate design with bits of mother of pearl and tiny pieces of stone of various colors. From the left shoulder depended a leopard's tail, while her feet were shod with sturdy little sandals. The knife was her only weapon. Its blade was of iron, the grip was wound with hide, and protected by a guard of 3 outbowing strips of flat iron, and upon the top of the hilt was a knob of gold. I took in much of this in the few seconds during which we stood facing each other, and I also observed another salient feature of her appearance. She was frightfully dirty. Her face and limbs and garment were streaked with mud and perspiration, and yet even so I felt that I had never looked upon so perfect and beautiful a creature as she. Her figure beggars description, and equally so her face. Were I one of those writer fellows, I should probably say that her features were Grecian, but being neither a writer nor a poet, I can do her greater justice by saying that she combined all of the finest lines that one sees in the typical American girl's face, rather than the pronounced sheep-like physiognomy of the Greek goddess. No, even the dirt couldn't hide that fact. She was beautiful beyond compare. As we stood looking at each other, a slow smile came to her face, parting her symmetrical lips and disclosing a row of strong white teeth. "Galu?" she asked with rising inflection. and remembering that I read in Bowen's manuscript that Galu seemed to indicate a higher type of man, I answered by pointing to myself and repeating the word. Then she started off on a regular catechism, if I could judge by her inflection, for I certainly understood no word of what she said. All the time the girl kept glancing toward the forest, and at last she touched my arm and pointed in that direction. Turning, I saw a hairy figure of a man-like thing standing watching us, and presently another and another emerged from the jungle and joined the leader until there must have been at least 20 of them. They were entirely naked. Their bodies were covered with hair, and though they stood upon their feet without touching their hands to the ground, they had a very ape-like appearance, since they stooped forward and had very long arms and quite apish features. They were not pretty to look upon, with the close-set eyes, flat noses, long upper lips, and protruding yellow fangs. "Alus," said the girl. I had reread Bowen's adventures so often that I knew them almost by heart, and so now I knew that I was looking upon the last remnant of that ancient man race, the Alus of a forgotten period, the speechless man of antiquity. "Kazor!" cried the girl, and at the same moment the Alus came jabbering toward us. They made strange growling, barking noises as, with much baring of fangs, they advanced upon us. They were armed only with nature's weapons, powerful muscles and giant fangs. Yet I knew that these were quite sufficient to overcome us had we nothing better to offer in defense, and so I drew my pistol and fired at the leader. He dropped like a stone, and the others turned and fled. Once again the girl smiled her slow smile and, stepping closer, caressed the barrel of my automatic. As she did so, her fingers came in contact with mine, and a sudden thrill ran through me, which I attributed to the fact that it had been so long since I had seen a woman of any sort or kind. She said something to me in her low, liquid tones, but I could not understand her, and then she pointed toward the north and started away. I followed her, for my way was north too, but had it been south, I still should have followed, so hungry was I for human companionship in this world of beasts and reptiles and half men. We walked along, the girl talking a great deal and seeming mystified that I could not understand her. Her silvery laugh rang merrily when I in turn essayed to speak to her, as though my language was the quaintest thing she ever had heard. Often, after fruitless attempts to make me understand, she would hold her palm toward me, saying "Galu," and then touch my breast or arm and cry "Alu, alu." I knew what she meant, for I had learned from Bowen's narrative the negative gesture and the two words which she repeated. She meant that I was no Galu, as I claimed, but an Alu, or speechless one. Yet every time she said this, she laughed again, and so infectious were her tones that I could only join her. It was only natural, too, that she should be mystified by my inability to comprehend her or to make her comprehend me, for from the clubmen, the lowest human type in Caspak to have speech, to the golden race of Galus, the tongues of the various tribes are identical, except for amplifications in the rising scale of evolution. She who is a Galu can understand one of the Bo lu and make herself understood to him, or to a hatchet man, a spearman, or an archer. The Ho lus, or apes, the Alus, and myself were the only creatures of human semblance with which she could hold no converse. Yet it was evident that her intelligence told her that I was neither Ho lu nor Alu, neither anthropoid ape nor speechless man. Yet she did not despair, but set out to teach me her language, and had it not been that I worried so greatly over the fate of Bowen and my companions of the Toreador, I could have wished the period of instruction prolonged. I never have been what one might call a ladies' man, though I liked their company immensely, and during my college days and since have made various friends among the sex. I think that I rather appeal to a certain type of girl for the reason that I never make love to them. I leave that to the numerous others who do it infinitely better than I could hope to, and take my pleasure out of girls' society in what seem to be more rational ways: dancing, golfing, boating, riding, tennis, and the like. Yet in the company of this half-naked little savage I found a new pleasure that was entirely distinct from any that I ever had experienced. When she touched me, I thrilled as I had never before thrilled in contact with another woman. I could not quite understand it, for I am sufficiently sophisticated to know that this is a symptom of love, and I certainly did not love this filthy little barbarian with her broken, unkempt nails and her skin so besmeared with mud and the green of crushed foliage that it was difficult to say what color it originally had been. But if she was outwardly uncouth, her clear eyes and strong, white, even teeth, her silvery laugh and her queenly carriage bespoke an innate fineness which dirt could not quite successfully conceal. The sun was low in the heavens when we came upon a little river which emptied into a large bay at the foot of low cliffs. Our journey so far had been beset with constant danger, as is every journey in this frightful land. I have not bored you with a recital of the wearying successions of attacks by the multitude of creatures which were constantly crossing our path or deliberately stalking us. We were always upon the alert, for here, to paraphrase, eternal vigilance is indeed the price of life. I had managed to progress a little in the acquisition of a knowledge of her tongue, so that I knew many of the animals and reptiles by their Caspakian names, and trees and ferns and grasses. I knew the words for sea and river and cliff, for sky and sun and cloud. Yes, I was getting along finely, and then it occurred to me that I didn't know my companion's name, so I pointed to myself and said "Tom," and to her and raised my eyebrows in interrogation. The girl ran her fingers into that mass of hair and looked puzzled. I repeated the action a dozen times. "Tom," she said finally in that clear, sweet, liquid voice. "Tom." I had never thought much of my name before, but when she spoke it, it sounded to me for the first time in my life like a mighty nice name. And then she brightened suddenly and tapped her own breast and said, "Ajor." "Ajor," I repeated, and she laughed and struck her palms together. Well, we knew each other's names now, and that was some satisfaction. I rather liked hers, Ajor, and she seemed to like mine, for she repeated it. We came to the cliffs beside the little river where it empties into the bay with the great inland sea beyond. The cliffs were weather-worn and rotted, and in one place a deep hollow ran back beneath the overhanging stone for several feet, suggesting shelter for the night. There were loose rocks strewn all about, with which I might build a barricade across the entrance to the cave, and so I halted there and pointed out the place to Ajor, trying to make her understand that we would spend the night there. As soon as she grasped my meaning, she assented with the Caspakian equivalent of an affirmative nod, and then touching my rifle, motioned me to follow her to the river. At the bank she paused, removed her belt and dagger, dropping them to the ground at her side. Then, unfastening the lower edge of her garment from the metal leg band to which it was attached, slipped it off her left shoulder and let it drop to the ground around her feet. It was done so naturally, so simply, and so quickly that it left me gasping like a fish out of water. Turning, she flashed a smile at me and then dived into the river, and there she bathed while I stood guard over her. For 5 or 10 minutes she splashed about, and when she emerged, her glistening skin was smooth and white and beautiful. Without means of drying herself, she simply ignored what to me would have seemed a necessity, and in a moment was arrayed in her simple though effective costume. It was now within an hour of darkness, and as I was nearly famished, I led the way back about a quarter of a mile to a low meadow where we had seen antelope and small horses a short time before. Here I brought down a young buck, the report of my rifle sending the balance of the herd scampering for the woods, where they were met by a chorus of hideous roars as the carnivora took advantage of their panic and leaped among them. With my hunting knife I removed a hind quarter, and then we returned to camp. Here I gathered a great quantity of wood from fallen trees, Ajor helping me, but before I built a fire, I also gathered sufficient loose rock to build my barricade against the frightful terrors of the night to come. I shall never forget the expression upon Ajor's face as she saw me strike a match and light the kindling beneath our campfire. It was such an expression as might transform a mortal face with awe as its owner beheld the mysterious workings of a divinity. It was evident that Ajor was quite unfamiliar with modern methods of fire making. She had thought my rifle and pistol wonderful, but these tiny slivers of wood, which from a magic rub brought a flame to the camp hearth, were indeed miracles to her. As the meat roasted above the fire, Ajor and I tried once again to talk, but though copiously filled with incentive, gestures and sounds, the conversation did not flourish notably. And then Ajor took up in earnest the task of teaching me her language. She commenced, as I later learned, with the simplest form of speech known to Caspak, or for that matter to the world, that employed by the Bo lu. I found it far from difficult, and even though it was a great handicap upon my instructor that she could not speak my language, she did remarkably well and demonstrated that she possessed ingenuity and intelligence of a high order. After we had eaten, I added to the pile of firewood so that I could replenish the fire before the entrance to our barricade, believing this as good a protection against the carnivora as we could have. And then Ajor and I sat down before it, and the lesson proceeded, while from all about us came the weird and awesome noises of the Caspakian night: the moaning and the coughing and roaring of the tigers, the panthers and the lions, the barking and the dismal howling of a wolf, jackal and hyaenodon, the shrill shrieks of stricken prey and the hissing of the great reptiles. The voice of man alone was silent. But though the voice of this choir terrible rose and fell from far and near in all directions, reaching at times such a tremendous volume of sound that the earth shook to it, yet so engrossed was I in my lesson and in my teacher that often I was deaf to what at another time would have filled me with awe. The face and voice of the beautiful girl who leaned so eagerly toward me as she tried to explain the meaning of some word or correct my pronunciation of another quite entirely occupied my every faculty of perception. The firelight shone upon her animated features and sparkling eyes. It accentuated the graceful motions of her gesturing arms and hands. It sparkled from her white teeth and from her golden ornaments, and glistened on the smooth firmness of her perfect skin. I am afraid that often I was more occupied with admiration of this beautiful animal than with a desire for knowledge. But be that as it may, I nevertheless learned much that evening, though part of what I learned had naught to do with any new language. Ajor seemed determined that I should speak Caspakian as quickly as possible, and I thought I saw in her desire a little of that all feminine trait which has come down through all the ages from the first lady of the world, curiosity. Ajor desired that I should speak her tongue in order that she might satisfy a curiosity concerning me that was filling her to a point where she was in danger of bursting. Of that I was positive. She was a regular little animated question mark. She bubbled over with interrogations which were never to be satisfied unless I learned to speak her tongue. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, her hand flew in expressive gestures, her little tongue raced with time, yet all to no avail. I could say man and tree and cliff and lion and a number of other words in perfect Caspakian, but such a vocabulary was only tantalizing. It did not lend itself well to a very general conversation, and the result was that Ajor would wax so wroth that she would clench her little fists and beat me on the breast as hard as ever she could, and then she would sink back laughing as the humor of the situation captured her. She was trying to teach me some verbs by going through the actions herself as she repeated the proper word. We were very much engrossed, so much so that we were giving no heed to what went on beyond our cave, when Ajor stopped very suddenly, crying, "Kazor!" Now she had been trying to teach me that Ju meant stop, so when she cried Kazor and at the same time stopped, I thought for a moment that this was part of my lesson. For the moment I forgot that Kazor means beware. I therefore repeated the word after her, but when I saw the expression in her eyes as they were directed past me and saw her point toward the entrance to the cave, I turned quickly to see a hideous face at the small aperture leading out into the night. It was the fierce and snarling countenance of a gigantic bear. I have hunted silvertips in the White Mountains of Arizona and thought them quite the largest and most formidable of big game, but from the appearance of the head of this awful creature I judged that the largest grizzly I had ever seen would shrink by comparison to the dimensions of a Newfoundland dog. Our fire was just within the cave, the smoke rising through the apertures between the rocks that I had piled in such a way that they arched inward toward the cliff at the top. The opening by means of which we were to reach the outside was barricaded with a few large fragments which did not by any means close it entirely, but through the apertures thus left no large animal could gain ingress. I had depended most, however, upon our fire, feeling that none of the dangerous nocturnal beasts of prey would venture close to the flames. In this, however, I was quite evidently in error, for the great bear stood with his nose not a foot from the blaze, which was now low owing to the fact that I had been so occupied with my lesson and my teacher that I had neglected to replenish it. Ajor whipped out her futile little knife and pointed to my rifle. At the same time she spoke in a quite level voice, entirely devoid of nervousness or any evidence of fear or panic. I knew she was exhorting me to fire upon the beast, but this I did not wish to do other than as a last resort, for I was quite sure that even my heavy bullets would not more than further enrage him, in which case he might easily force an entrance to our cave. Instead of firing, I piled some more wood upon the fire, and as the smoke and blaze arose in the beast's face, it backed away, growling most frightfully. But I still could see two ugly points of light blazing in the outer darkness and hear its growls rumbling terrifically without. For some time the creature stood there watching the entrance to our frail sanctuary, while I racked my brains in futile endeavor to plan some method of defense or escape. I knew full well that should the bear make a determined effort to get at us, the rocks I had piled as a barrier would come tumbling down about his giant shoulders like a house of cards, and that he would walk directly in upon us. Ajor, having less knowledge of the effectiveness of firearms than I, and therefore greater confidence in them, entreated me to shoot the beast, but I knew that the chance that I could stop it with a single shot was most remote, while that I should but infuriate it was real and present. And so I waited for what seemed an eternity, watching those devilish points of fire glaring balefully at us, and listening to the ever increasing volume of those seismic growls which seemed to rumble upward from the bowels of the earth, shaking the very cliffs beneath which we cowered, until at last I saw that the brute was again approaching the aperture. It availed me nothing that I piled the blaze high with firewood until Ajor and I were near to roasting. On came that mighty engine of destruction, until once again the hideous face yawned its fanged yawn directly within the barrier's opening. It stood thus a moment, and then the head was withdrawn. I breathed a sigh of relief. The thing had altered its intention, and was going on in search of other and more easily procurable prey. The fire had been too much for it. But my joy was short-lived, and my heart sank once again as a moment later I saw a mighty paw insinuated into the opening, a paw as large around as a large dishpan. Very gently the paw toyed with the great rock that partly closed the entrance, pushed and pulled upon it, and then very deliberately drew it outward and to one side. Again came the head, and this time much farther into the cavern, but still the great shoulders would not pass through the opening. Ajor moved closer to me until her shoulder touched my side, and I thought I felt a slight tremor run through her body, but otherwise she gave no indication of fear. Involuntarily I threw my left arm about her and drew her to me for an instant. It was an act of reassurance rather than a caress, though I must admit that again, and even in the face of death, I thrilled at the contact with her. And then I released her and threw my rifle to my shoulder, for at last I had reached the conclusion that nothing more could be gained by waiting. My only hope was to get as many shots into the creature as I could before it was upon me. Already it had torn away a second rock and was in the very act of forcing its huge bulk through the opening it had now made. So now I took careful aim between its eyes. My right fingers closed firmly and evenly upon the small of the stock, drawing back my trigger finger by the muscular action of the hand. The bullet could not fail to hit its mark. I held my breath lest I swerve the muzzle a hair by my breathing. I was as steady and cool as I ever had been upon a target range, and I had the full consciousness of a perfect hit in anticipation. I knew that I could not miss. And then, as the bear surged forward toward me, the hammer fell futilely upon an imperfect cartridge. Almost simultaneously I heard from without a perfectly hellish roar. The bear gave voice to a series of growls far transcending in volume and ferocity anything that he had yet essayed, and at the same time backed quickly from the cave. For an instant I couldn't understand what had happened to cause this sudden retreat, when his prey was practically within his clutches. The idea that the harmless clicking of the hammer had frightened him was too ridiculous to entertain. However, we had not long to wait before we could at least guess at the cause of the diversion, for from without came mingled growls and roars and the sound of great bodies thrashing about until the earth shook. The bear had been attacked in the rear by some other mighty beast, and the two were now locked in a titanic struggle for supremacy. With brief respites, during which we could hear the labored breathing of the contestants, the battle continued for the better part of an hour, until the sounds of combat grew gradually less and finally ceased entirely. At Ajor's suggestion, made by signs and a few of the words we knew in common, I moved the fire directly to the entrance to the cave, so that a beast would have to pass directly through the flames to reach us, and then we sat and waited for the victor of the battle to come and claim his reward. But though we sat for a long time with our eyes glued to the opening, we saw no sign of any beast. At last I signed to Ajor to lie down, for I knew that she must have sleep, and I sat on guard until nearly morning, when the girl awoke and insisted that I take some rest. Nor would she be denied, but dragged me down as she laughingly menaced me with her knife. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The People That Time Forgot. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The People That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 3. When I awoke, it was daylight, and I found Ajor squatting before a fine bed of coals, roasting a large piece of antelope meat. Believe me, the sight of the new day and the delicious odor of the cooking meat filled me with renewed happiness and hope that had been all but expunged by the experience of the previous night. And perhaps the slender figure of the bright-faced girl proved also a potent restorative. She looked up and smiled at me, showing those perfect teeth, and dimpling with evident happiness, the most adorable picture that I had ever seen. I recall that it was then I first regretted that she was only a little untutored savage, and so far beneath me in the scale of evolution. Her first act was to beckon me to follow her outside, and there she pointed to the explanation of our rescue from the bear, a huge saber-toothed tiger, its fine coat and its flesh torn to ribbons, lying dead a few paces from our cave, and beside it, equally mangled and disemboweled, was the carcass of a huge cave bear. To have had one's life saved by a saber-toothed tiger, and in the 20th century into the bargain, was an experience that was, to say the least, unique. But it had happened. I had the proof of it before my eyes. So enormous are the great carnivora of Caspak that they must feed perpetually to support their giant thews, and the result is that they will eat the meat of any other creature, and will attack anything that comes within their ken, no matter how formidable the quarry. From later observation, I mention this as worthy the attention of paleontologists and naturalists, I came to the conclusion that such creatures as the cave bear, the cave lion, and the saber-toothed tiger, as well as the larger carnivorous reptiles, make ordinarily 2 kills a day, one in the morning and one after night. They immediately devour the entire carcass, after which they lie up and sleep for a few hours. Fortunately, their numbers are comparatively few, otherwise there would be no other life within Caspak. It is their very voracity that keeps their numbers down to a point which permits other forms of life to persist, for even in the season of love the great males often turn upon their own mates and devour them, while both males and females occasionally devour their young. How the human and semi-human races have managed to survive during all the countless ages that these conditions must have existed here is quite beyond me. After breakfast, Ajor and I set out once more upon our northward journey. We had gone but a little distance when we were attacked by a number of ape-like creatures armed with clubs. They seemed a little higher in the scale than the Alus. Ajor told me they were Bo-lu, or clubmen. A revolver shot killed one and scattered the others, but several times later during the day we were menaced by them, until we had left their country and entered that of the Sto-lu, or hatchet men. These people were less hairy and more manlike, nor did they appear so anxious to destroy us. Rather, they were curious and followed us for some distance, examining us most closely. They called out to us, and Ajor answered them, but her replies did not seem to satisfy them, for they gradually became threatening, and I think they were preparing to attack us when a small deer that had been hiding in some low brush suddenly broke cover and dashed across our front. We needed meat, for it was near 1 o'clock and I was getting hungry, so I drew my pistol and with a single shot dropped the creature in its tracks. The effect upon the Bo-lu was electrical. Immediately they abandoned all thoughts of war, and turning, scampered for the forest which fringed our path. That night we spent beside a little stream in the Sto-lu country. We found a tiny cave in the rock bank, so hidden away that only chance could direct a beast of prey to it, and after we had eaten of the deer meat and some fruit which Ajor gathered, we crawled into the little hole, and with sticks and stones which I had gathered for the purpose, I erected a strong barricade inside the entrance. Nothing could reach us without swimming and wading through the stream, and I felt quite secure from attack. Our quarters were rather cramped. The ceiling was so low that we could not stand up, and the floor so narrow that it was with difficulty that we both wedged into it together. But we were very tired, and so we made the most of it, and so great was the feeling of security that I am sure I fell asleep as soon as I had stretched myself beside Ajor. During the 3 days which followed, our progress was exasperatingly slow. I doubt if we made 10 miles in the entire 3 days. The country was hideously savage, so that we were forced to spend hours at a time in hiding from one or another of the great beasts which menaced us continually. There were fewer reptiles, but the quantity of carnivora seemed to have increased, and the reptiles that we did see were perfectly gigantic. I shall never forget one enormous specimen which we came upon browsing upon water reeds at the edge of the great sea. It stood well over 12 feet high at the rump, its highest point, and with its enormously long tail and neck it was somewhere between 75 and 100 feet in length. Its head was ridiculously small, its body was unarmored, but its great bulk gave it a most formidable appearance. My experience of Caspakian life led me to believe that the gigantic creature would but have to see us to attack us, and so I raised my rifle and at the same time drew away toward some brush which offered concealment. But Ajor only laughed, and picking up a stick, ran toward the great thing, shouting. The little head was raised high upon the long neck as that animal stupidly looked here and there in search of the author of the disturbance. At last its eyes discovered tiny little Ajor, and then she hurled the stick at the diminutive head. With a cry that sounded not unlike the bleat of a sheep, the colossal creature shuffled into the water and was soon submerged. As I slowly recalled my collegiate studies and paleontological readings in Bowen's textbooks, I realized that I had looked upon nothing less than a diplodocus of the Upper Jurassic, but how infinitely different was the true, living thing from the crude restorations of Hatcher and Holland. I had had the idea that the diplodocus was a land animal, but evidently it is partially amphibious. I have seen several since my first encounter, and in each case the creature took to the sea for concealment as soon as it was disturbed. With the exception of its gigantic tail, it has no weapon of defense, but with this appendage it can lash so terrific a blow as to lay low even a giant cave bear, stunned and broken. It is a stupid, simple, gentle beast, one of the few within Caspak which such a description might even remotely fit. For 3 nights we slept in trees, finding no caves or other places of concealment. Here we were free from the attacks of the large land carnivora, but the smaller flying reptiles, the snakes, leopards, and panthers, were a constant menace, though by no means as much to be feared as the huge beasts that roamed the surface of the earth. At the close of the 3rd day, Ajor and I were able to converse with considerable fluency, and it was a great relief to both of us, especially to Ajor. She now did nothing but ask questions whenever I would let her, which could not be all the time, as our preservation depended largely upon the rapidity with which I could gain knowledge of the geography and customs of Caspak, and accordingly I had to ask numerous questions myself. I enjoyed immensely hearing and answering her, so naive were many of her queries and so filled with wonder was she at the things I told her of the world beyond the lofty barriers of Caspak. Not once did she seem to doubt me, however marvelous my statements must have seemed, and doubtless they were the cause of marvel to Ajor, who before had never dreamed that any life existed beyond Caspak and the life she knew. Artless though many of her questions were, they evidenced a keen intellect and a shrewdness which seemed far beyond her years of her experience. Altogether I was finding my little savage a mighty interesting and companionable person, and I often thanked the kind fate that directed the crossing of our paths. From her I learned much of Caspak, but there still remained the mystery that had proved so baffling to Bowen Tyler: the total absence of young among the ape, the semi-human, and the human races with which both he and I had come in contact upon opposite shores of the inland sea. Ajor tried to explain the matter to me, though it was apparent that she could not conceive how so natural a condition should demand explanation. She told me that among the Galus there were a few babies, that she had once been a baby, but that most of her people came up, as she put it, corsvajo, or literally from the beginning. And as they all did when they used that phrase, she would wave a broad gesture toward the south. "For long," she explained, leaning very close to me and whispering the words into my ear while she cast apprehensive glances about and mostly skyward, "for long my mother kept me hidden lest the Wieroo, passing through the air by night, should come and take me away to Oo-oh." And the child shuddered as she voiced the word. I tried to get her to tell me more, but her terror was so real when she spoke of the Wieroo and the land of Oo-oh where they dwell that I at last desisted, though I did learn that the Wieroo carried off only female babes and occasionally women of the Galus who had come up from the beginning. It was all very mysterious and unfathomable, but I got the idea that the Wieroo were creatures of imagination, the demons or gods of her race, omniscient and omnipresent. This led me to assume that the Galus had a religious sense, and further questioning brought out the fact that such was the case. Ajor spoke in tones of reverence of Luata, the god of heat and life. The word is derived from two others, Lua meaning sun, and Ata meaning variously eggs, life, young, and reproduction. She told me that they worshipped Luata in several forms, as fire, the sun, eggs, and other material objects which suggested heat and reproduction. I had noticed that whenever I built a fire, Ajor outlined in the air before her with a forefinger an isosceles triangle, and that she did the same in the morning when she first viewed the sun. At first I had not connected her act with anything in particular, but after we learned to converse and she had explained a little of her religious superstitions, I realized that she was making the sign of the triangle as a Roman Catholic makes the sign of the cross. Always the short side of the triangle was uppermost. As she explained all this to me, she pointed to the decorations on her golden armlets, upon the knob of her dagger hilt, and upon the band which encircled her right leg above the knee. Always was the design partly made up of isosceles triangles, and when she explained the significance of this particular geometric figure, I at once grasped its appropriateness. We were now in the country of the Band lu, the spearmen of Caspak. Bowen had remarked in his narrative that these people were analogous to the so-called Cro-Magnon race of the Upper Paleolithic, and I was therefore very anxious to see them. Nor was I to be disappointed. I saw them all right. We had left the Sto lu country and literally fought our way through cordons of wild beasts for 2 days, when we decided to make camp a little earlier than usual, owing to the fact that we had reached a line of cliffs running east and west, in which were numerous likely cave lodgings. We were both very tired, and the sight of these caverns, several of which could be easily barricaded, decided us to halt until the following morning. It took but a few minutes' exploration to discover one particular cavern high up the face of the cliff which seemed ideal for our purpose. It opened upon a narrow ledge where we could build our cook fire. The opening was so small that we had to lie flat and wriggle through it to gain ingress, while the interior was high ceiled and spacious. I lighted a faggot and looked about, but as far as I could see, the chamber ran back into the cliff. Laying aside my rifle, pistol, and the heavy ammunition belt, I left Ajor in the cave while I went down to gather firewood. We already had meat and fruits which we had gathered just before reaching the cliffs, and my canteen was filled with fresh water. Therefore all we required was fuel, and as I always saved Ajor's strength when I could, I would not permit her to accompany me. The poor girl was very tired, but she would have gone with me until she dropped, I know, so loyal was she. She was the best comrade in the world, and sometimes I regretted and sometimes I was glad that she was not of my own caste, for had she been, I should unquestionably have fallen in love with her. As it was, we traveled together like two boys, with huge respect for each other, but no softer sentiment. There was little timber close to the base of the cliffs, and so I was forced to enter the woods some 200 yards distant. I realized now how foolhardy was my act in such a land as Caspak, teeming with danger and with death, but there is a certain amount of fool in every man, and whatever proportion of it I own must have been in the ascendant that day, for the truth of the matter is that I went down into those woods absolutely defenseless, and I paid the price, as people usually do for their indiscretions. As I searched around in the brush for likely pieces of firewood, my head bowed and my eyes upon the ground, I suddenly felt a great weight hurl itself upon me. I struggled to my knees and seized my assailant, a huge, naked man, naked except for a breechcloth of snakeskin, the head hanging down to the knees. The fellow was armed with a stone-shod spear, a stone knife, and a hatchet. In his black hair were several gay-colored feathers. As we struggled to and fro, I was slowly gaining advantage of him, when a score of his fellows came running up and overpowered me. They bound my hands behind me with long rawhide thongs, and then surveyed me critically. I found them fine-looking specimens of manhood, for the most part. There were some among them who bore a resemblance to the Sto lu and were hairy, but the majority had massive heads and not unlovely features. There was little about them to suggest the ape, as in the Sto lu, Bo lu, and Alus. I expected them to kill me at once, but they did not. Instead, they questioned me, but it was evident that they did not believe my story, for they scoffed and laughed. "The Galus have turned you out," they cried. "If you go back to them, you will die. If you remain here, you will die. We shall kill you, but first we shall have a dance, and you shall dance with us, the dance of death." It sounded quite reassuring, but I knew that I was not to be killed immediately, and so I took heart. They led me toward the cliffs, and as we approached them, I glanced up and was sure that I saw Ajor's bright eyes peering down upon us from our lofty cave; but she gave no sign if she saw me, and we passed on, rounded the end of the cliffs, and proceeded along the opposite face of them until we came to a section literally honeycombed with caves. All about, upon the ground and swarming the ledges before the entrances, were hundreds of members of the tribe. There were many women, but no babes or children, though I noticed that the females had better developed breasts than any that I had seen among the hatchet men, the club men, the Alus, or the apes. In fact, among the lower orders of Caspakian man, the female breast is but a rudimentary organ, barely suggested in the apes and Alus, and only a little more defined in the Bo lu and Sto lu, though always increasingly so until it is found about half developed in the females of the spearmen. Yet never was there an indication that the females had suckled young, nor were there any young among them. Some of the Band lu women were quite comely. The figures of all, both men and women, were symmetrical though heavy, and though there were some who verged strongly upon the Sto lu type, there were others who were positively handsome and whose bodies were quite hairless. The Alus are all bearded, but among the Bo lu the beard disappears in the women. The Sto lu men show a sparse beard, the Band lu none, and there is little hair upon the bodies of their women. The members of the tribe showed great interest in me, especially in my clothing, the like of which, of course, they never had seen. They pulled and hauled upon me, and some of them struck me, but for the most part they were not inclined to brutality. It was only the hairier ones who most closely resembled the Sto lu who maltreated me. At last my captors led me into a great cave in the mouth of which a fire was burning. The floor was littered with filth, including the bones of many animals, and the atmosphere reeked with the stench of human bodies and putrefying flesh. Here they fed me, releasing my arms, and I ate of half-cooked aurochs steak and a stew which may have been made of snakes, for many of the long round pieces of meat suggested them most nauseatingly. The meal completed, they led me well within the cavern, which they lighted with torches stuck in various crevices, in the light of which I saw, to my astonishment, that the walls were covered with paintings and etchings. There were aurochs, red deer, saber-toothed tiger, cave bear, hyaenodon, and many other examples of the fauna of Caspak, done in colors, usually of 4 shades of brown, or scratched upon the surface of the rock. Often they were superimposed upon each other until it required careful examination to trace out the various outlines. But they all showed a rather remarkable aptitude for delineation, which further fortified Bowen's comparisons between these people and the extinct Cro-Magnons whose ancient art is still preserved in the caverns of Niaux and Le Portel. The Band lu, however, did not have the bow and arrow, and in this respect they differ from their extinct progenitors or descendants of Western Europe. Should any of my friends chance to read the story of my adventures upon Caprona, I hope they will not be bored by these diversions, and if they are, I can only say that I am writing my memoirs for my own edification, and therefore setting down those things which interested me particularly at the time. I have no desire that the general public should ever have access to these pages, but it is possible that my friends may, and also certain savants who are interested, and to them, while I do not apologize for my philosophizing, I humbly explain that they are witnessing the gropings of a finite mind after the infinite, the search for explanations of the inexplicable. In a far recess of the cavern my captors bade me halt. Again my hands were secured, and this time my feet as well. During the operation they questioned me, and I was mighty glad that the marked similarity between the various tribal tongues of Caspak enabled us to understand each other perfectly, even though they were unable to believe or even to comprehend the truth of my origin and the circumstances of my advent in Caspak. And finally they left me, saying that they would come for me before the dance of death upon the morrow. Before they departed with their torches, I saw that I had not been conducted to the farthest extremity of the cavern, for a dark and gloomy corridor led beyond my prison room into the heart of the cliff. I could not but marvel at the immensity of this great underground grotto. Already I had traversed several hundred yards of it, from many points of which other corridors diverged. The whole cliff must be honeycombed with apartments and passages of which this community occupied but a comparatively small part, so that the possibility of the more remote passages being the lair of savage beasts that have other means of ingress and egress than that used by the Band lu filled me with dire forebodings. I believe that I am not ordinarily hysterically apprehensive, yet I must confess that under the conditions with which I was confronted, I felt my nerves to be somewhat shaken. On the morrow I was to die some sort of nameless death for the diversion of a savage horde, but the morrow held fewer terrors for me than the present, and I submit to any fair-minded man, if it is not a terrifying thing to lie bound hand and foot in the Stygian blackness of an immense cave peopled by unknown dangers in a land overrun by hideous beasts and reptiles of the greatest ferocity. At any moment, perhaps at this very moment, some silent-footed beast of prey might catch my scent where it laired in some contiguous passage and might creep stealthily upon me. I craned my neck about and stared through the inky darkness for the twin spots of blazing hate which I knew would herald the coming of my executioner. So real were the imaginings of my overwrought brain that I broke into a cold sweat in absolute conviction that some beast was close before me. Yet the hours dragged, and no sound broke the grave-like stillness of the cavern. During that period of eternity, many events of my life passed before my mental vision, a vast parade of friends and occurrences which would be blotted out forever on the morrow. I cursed myself for the foolish act which had taken me from the search party that so depended upon me, and I wondered what progress, if any, they had made. Were they still beyond the barrier cliffs awaiting my return, or had they found a way into Caspak? I felt that the latter would be the truth, for the party was not made up of men easily turned from a purpose. Quite probable it was that they were already searching for me, but that they would ever find a trace of me I doubted. Long since I had come to the conclusion that it was beyond human prowess to circle the shores of the inland sea of Caspak in the face of the myriad menaces which lurked in every shadow by day and by night. Long since had I given up any hope of reaching the point where I had made my entry into the country, and so I was now equally convinced that our entire expedition had been worse than futile before ever it was conceived, since Bowen Tyler and his wife could not by any possibility have survived during all these long months. No more could Bradley and his party of seamen be yet in existence. If the superior force and equipment of my party enabled them to circle the north end of the sea, they might some day come upon the broken wreck of my plane hanging in the great tree to the south, but long before that my bones would be added to the litter upon the floor of this mighty cavern. And through all my thoughts, real and fanciful, moved the image of a perfect girl, clear-eyed and strong and straight and beautiful, with the carriage of a queen and the supple, undulating grace of a leopard. Though I loved my friends, their fate seemed of less importance to me than the fate of this little barbarian stranger, for whom, I had convinced myself many a time, I felt no greater sentiment than passing friendship for a fellow wayfarer in this land of horrors. Yet I so worried and fretted about her and her future that at last I quite forgot my own predicament, though I still struggled intermittently with bonds in vain endeavor to free myself, as much, however, that I might hasten to her protection as that I might escape the fate which had been planned for me. And while I was thus engaged, and had for the moment forgotten my apprehensions concerning prowling beasts, I was startled into tense silence by a distinct and unmistakable sound coming from the dark corridor farther toward the heart of the cliff, the sound of padded feet moving stealthily in my direction. I believe that never before in all my life, even amidst the terrors of childhood nights, have I suffered such a sensation of extreme horror as I did that moment in which I realized that I must lie bound and helpless while some horrid beast of prey crept upon me to devour me in that utter darkness of the Band lu pits of Caspak. I reeked with cold sweat, and my flesh crawled. I could feel it crawl. If ever I came nearer to abject cowardice, I do not recall the instance. And yet it was not that I was afraid to die, for I had long since given myself up as lost. A few days of Caspak must impress anyone with the utter nothingness of life. The waters, the land, the air teem with it, and always it is being devoured by some other form of life. Life is the cheapest thing in Caspak, as it is the cheapest thing on earth, and doubtless the cheapest cosmic production. No, I was not afraid to die. In fact, I prayed for death, that I might be relieved of the frightfulness of the interval of life which remained to me, the waiting, the awful waiting, for that fearsome beast to reach me and to strike. Presently it was so close that I could hear its breathing, and then it touched me and leaped quickly back as though it had come upon me unexpectedly. For long moments no sound broke the sepulchral silence of the cave. Then I heard a movement on the part of the creature near me, and again it touched me, and I felt something like a hairless hand pass over my face and down until it touched the collar of my flannel shirt, and then, subdued but filled with pent emotion, a voice cried, "Tom!" I think I nearly fainted, so great was the reaction. "Ajor!" I managed to say. "Ajor, my girl, can it be you?" "Oh, Tom!" she cried again in a trembly little voice, and flung herself upon me, sobbing softly. I had not known that Ajor could cry. As she cut away my bonds, she told me that from the entrance to our cave she had seen the Band lu coming out of the forest with me, and she had followed until they took me into the cave, which she had seen was upon the opposite side of the cliff in which ours was located, and then, knowing that she could do nothing for me until after the Band lu slept, she had hastened to return to our cave. With difficulty she had reached it, after having been stalked by a cave lion and almost seized. I trembled at the risk she had run. It had been her intention to wait until after midnight, when most of the carnivora would have made their kills, and then attempt to reach the cave in which I was imprisoned and rescue me. She explained that with my rifle and pistol, both of which she assured me she could use, having watched me so many times, she planned upon frightening the Band lu and forcing them to give me up. Brave little girl! She would have risked her life willingly to save me; but some time after she reached our cave, she heard voices from the far recesses within, and immediately concluded that we had but found another entrance to the caves which the Band lu occupied upon the other face of the cliff. Then she had set out through those winding passages and in total darkness had groped her way, guided solely by a marvelous sense of direction, to where I lay. She had had to proceed with utmost caution lest she fall into some abyss in the darkness, and in truth she had thrice come upon sheer drops and had been forced to take the most frightful risks to pass them. I shudder even now as I contemplate what this girl passed through for my sake, and how she enhanced her peril in loading herself down with the weight of my arms and ammunition, and the awkwardness of the long rifle which she was unaccustomed to bearing. I could have knelt and kissed her hand in reverence and gratitude, nor am I ashamed to say that this is precisely what I did after I had been freed from my bonds and heard the story of her trials. Brave little Ajor! Wonder girl out of the dim, unthinkable past! Never before had she been kissed, but she seemed to sense something of the meaning of the new caress, for she leaned forward in the dark and pressed her own lips to my forehead. A sudden urge surged through me to seize her and strain her to my bosom and cover her hot young lips with the kisses of a real love; but I did not do so, for I knew that I did not love her, and to have kissed her thus with passion would have been to inflict a great wrong upon her who had offered her life for mine. No, Ajor should be as safe with me as with her own mother, if she had one, which I was inclined to doubt, even though she told me that she had once been a babe and hidden by her mother. I had come to doubt if there was such a thing as a mother in Caspak, a mother such as we know. From the Bo lu to the Kro lu there is no word which corresponds with our word mother. They speak of Ata, or Kor Sva jo, meaning reproduction, and from the beginning, and point toward the south, but no one has a mother. After considerable difficulty we gained what we thought was our cave, only to find that it was not, and then we realized that we were lost in the labyrinthine mazes of the great cavern. We retraced our steps and sought the point from which we had started, but only succeeded in losing ourselves the more. Ajor was aghast, not so much from fear of our predicament, but that she should have failed in the functioning of that wonderful sense she possessed in common with most other creatures Caspakian, which makes it possible for them to move unerringly from place to place without compass or guide. Hand in hand we crept along, searching for an opening into the outer world, yet realizing that at each step we might be burrowing more deeply into the heart of the great cliff, or circling futilely in the vague wandering that could end only in death. and the darkness, it was almost palpable and utterly depressing. I had matches, and in some of the more difficult places I struck one, but we couldn't afford to waste them, and so we groped our way slowly along, doing the best we could to keep to one general direction in the hope that it would eventually lead us to an opening into the outer world. When I struck matches, I noticed that the walls bore no paintings, nor was there other sign that man had penetrated this far within the cliff, nor any spoor of animals of other kinds. It would be difficult to guess at the time we spent wandering through those black corridors, climbing steep ascents, feeling our way along the edges of bottomless pits, never knowing at what moment we might be plunged into some abyss, and always haunted by the ever-present terror of death by starvation and thirst. As difficult as it was, I still realized that it might have been infinitely worse had I had another companion than Ajor. Courageous, uncomplaining, loyal little Ajor! She was tired and hungry and thirsty, and she must have been discouraged, but she never faltered in her cheerfulness. I asked her if she was afraid, and she replied that here the Wieroo could not get her, and that if she died of hunger, she would at least die with me, and she was quite content that such should be her end. At the time I attributed her attitude to something akin to a dog-like devotion to a new master who had been kind to her. I can take oath to the fact that I did not think it was anything more. Whether we had been imprisoned in the cliff for a day or a week, I could not say, nor even now do I know. We became very tired and hungry. The hours dragged. We slept at least twice, and then we rose and stumbled on, always weaker and weaker. There were ages during which the trend of the corridor was always upward. It was heartbreaking work for people in the state of exhaustion in which we then were, but we clung tenaciously to it. We stumbled and fell. We sank through pure physical inability to retain our feet, but always we managed to rise at last and go on. At first, wherever it had been possible, we had walked hand in hand, lest we become separated, and later, when I saw that Ajor was weakening rapidly, we went side by side, I supporting her with an arm about her waist. I still retained the heavy burden of my armament, but with the rifle slung to my back, my hands were free. When I too showed indisputable evidences of exhaustion, Ajor suggested that I lay aside my arms and ammunition, but I told her that as it would mean certain death for me to traverse Caspak without them, I might as well take the chance of dying here in the cave with them, for there was the other chance that we might find our way to liberty. There came a time when Ajor could no longer walk, and then it was that I picked her up in my arms and carried her. She begged me to leave her, saying that after I found an exit, I could come back and get her; but she knew, and she knew that I knew, that if I ever did leave her, I could never find her again. Yet she insisted. Barely had I sufficient strength to take a score of steps at a time. Then I would have to sink down and rest for 5 to 10 minutes. I don't know what force urged me on and kept me going in the face of an absolute conviction that my efforts were utterly futile. I counted us already as good as dead, but still I dragged myself along until the time came that I could no longer rise, but could only crawl along a few inches at a time, dragging Ajor beside me. Her sweet voice, now almost inaudible from weakness, implored me to abandon her and save myself. She seemed to think only of me. Of course I couldn't have left her there alone, no matter how much I might have desired to do so, but the fact of the matter was that I didn't desire to leave her. What I said to her then came very simply and naturally to my lips. It couldn't very well have been otherwise, I imagine, for with death so close, I doubt if people are much inclined to heroics. "I would rather not get out at all, Ajor," I said to her, "than to get out without you." We were resting against a rocky wall, and Ajor was leaning against me, her head on my breast. I could feel her press closer to me, and one hand stroked my arm in a weak caress, but she didn't say anything, nor were words necessary. After a few minutes more rest, we started on again upon our utterly hopeless way. But I soon realized that I was weakening rapidly, and presently I was forced to admit that I was through. "It's no use, Ajor," I said. "I've come as far as I can. It may be that if I sleep, I can go on again after." But I knew that that was not true, and that the end was near. "Yes, sleep," said Ajor. "We will sleep together forever." She crept close to me as I lay on the hard floor and pillowed her head upon my arm. With the little strength which remained to me, I drew her up until our lips touched, and then I whispered, "Good bye." I must have lost consciousness almost immediately, for I recall nothing more until I suddenly awoke out of a troubled sleep, during which I dreamed that I was drowning, to find the cave lighted by what appeared to be diffused daylight, and a tiny trickle of water running down the corridor and forming a puddle in the little depression in which it chanced that Ajor and I lay. I turned my eyes quickly upon Ajor, fearful for what the light might disclose; but she still breathed, though very faintly. Then I searched about for an explanation of the light, and soon discovered that it came from about a bend in the corridor just ahead of us and at the top of a steep incline, and instantly I realized that Ajor and I had stumbled by night almost to the portal of salvation. Had chance taken us a few yards further up either of the corridors which diverged from ours just ahead of us, we might have been irrevocably lost. We might still be lost, but at least we could die in the light of day, out of the horrid blackness of this terrible cave. I tried to rise, and found that sleep had given me back a portion of my strength, and then I tasted the water and was further refreshed. I shook Ajor gently by the shoulder, but she did not open her eyes, and then I gathered a few drops of water in my cupped palm and let them trickle between her lips. This revived her so that she raised her lids, and when she saw me, she smiled. "What happened?" she asked. "Where are we?" "We are at the end of the corridor," I replied, "and daylight is coming in from the outside world just ahead. We are saved, Ajor." She sat up then and looked about, and then, quite womanlike, she burst into tears. It was the reaction, of course. And then, too, she was very weak. I took her in my arms and quieted her as best I could, and finally, with my help, she got to her feet, for she, as well as I, had found some slight recuperation in sleep. Together we staggered upward toward the light, and at the first turn we saw an opening a few yards ahead of us and a leaden sky beyond, a leaden sky from which was falling a drizzling rain, the author of our little trickling stream which had given us drink when we were most in need of it. The cave had been damp and cold, but as we crawled through the aperture, the muggy warmth of the Caspakian air caressed and confronted us. Even the rain was warmer than the atmosphere of those dark corridors. We had water now, and warmth, and I was sure that Caspak would soon offer us meat or fruit. But as we came to where we could look about, we saw that we were upon the summit of the cliffs, where there seemed little reason to expect game. However, there were trees, and among them we soon descried edible fruits with which we broke our long fast. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The People That Time Forgot. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The People That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 4. We spent 2 days upon the cliff top resting and recuperating. There was some small game which gave us meat, and the little pools of rainwater were sufficient to quench our thirst. The sun came out a few hours after we emerged from the cave, and in its warmth we soon cast off the gloom which our recent experiences had saddled upon us. Upon the morning of the 3rd day we set out to search for a path down to the valley. Below us, to the north, we saw a large pool lying at the foot of the cliffs, and in it we could discern the women of the Band lu lying in the shallow waters, while beyond and close to the base of the mighty barrier cliffs there was a large party of Band lu warriors going north to hunt. We had a splendid view from our lofty cliff top. Dimly to the west we could see the farther shore of the inland sea, and southwest the large southern island loomed distinctly before us. A little east of north was the northern island which Ajor, shuddering, whispered was the home of the Wieroo, the land of Oo-oh. It lay at the far end of the lake and was barely visible to us, being fully 60 miles away. From our elevation and in a clearer atmosphere it would have stood out distinctly, but the air of Caspak is heavy with moisture, with the result that distant objects are blurred and indistinct. Ajor also told me that the mainland east of Oo-oh was her land, the land of the Galu. She pointed out the cliffs at its southern boundary which marked the frontier, south of which lies the country of Kro-lu, the archers. We had now but to pass through the balance of the Band lu territory and that of the Kro-lu to be within the confines of her own land; but that meant traversing 35 miles of hostile country filled with every imaginable terror, and possibly many beyond the powers of imagination. I would certainly have given a lot for my plane at that moment, for with it 20 minutes would have landed us within the confines of Ajor's country. We finally found a place where we could slip over the edge of the cliff onto a narrow ledge which seemed to give evidence of being something of a game path to the valley, though it apparently had not been used for some time. I lowered Ajor at the end of my rifle and then slid over myself, and I am free to admit that my hair stood on end during the process, for the drop was considerable and the ledge appallingly narrow, with a frightful drop sheer below down to the rocks at the base of the cliff. But with Ajor there to catch and steady me, I made it all right, and then we set off down the trail toward the valley. There were 2 or 3 more bad places, but for the most part it was an easy descent, and we came to the highest of the Band lu caves without further trouble. Here we went more slowly, lest we should be set upon by some member of the tribe. We must have passed about half the Band lu cave levels before we were accosted, and then a huge fellow stepped out in front of me, barring our further progress. "Who are you?" he asked, and he recognized me and I him, for he had been one of those who had led me back into the cave and bound me the night that I had been captured. From me his gaze went to Ajor. He was a fine-looking man with clear, intelligent eyes, a good forehead and superb physique, by far the highest type of Caspakian I had yet seen, barring Ajor, of course. "You are a true Galu," he said to Ajor, "but this man is of a different mold. He has the face of a Galu, but his weapons and the strange skins he wears upon his body are not of the Galus nor of Caspak. Who is he?" "He is Tom," replied Ajor succinctly. "There is no such people," asserted the Band lu quite truthfully, toying with his spear in a most suggestive manner. "My name is Tom," I explained, "and I am from a country beyond Caspak." I thought it best to propitiate him if possible, because of the necessity of conserving ammunition as well as to avoid the loud alarm of a shot which might bring other Band lu warriors upon us. "I am from America, a land of which you never heard, and I am seeking others of my countrymen who are in Caspak and from whom I am lost. I have no quarrel with you or your people. Let us go our way in peace." "You are going there?" he asked, and pointed toward the north. "I am," I replied. He was silent for several minutes, apparently weighing some thought in his mind. At last he spoke. "What is that?" he asked. "And what is that?" He pointed first at my rifle and then to my pistol. "They are weapons," I replied, "weapons which kill at a great distance." I pointed to the women in the pool beneath us. "With this," I said, tapping my pistol, "I could kill as many of those women as I cared to without moving a step from where we now stand." He looked his incredulity, but I went on. "And with this," I weighed my rifle at the balance in the palm of my right hand, "I could slay one of those distant warriors," and I waved my left hand toward the tiny figures of the hunters far to the north. The fellow laughed. "Do it," he cried derisively, "and then it may be that I shall believe the balance of your strange story." "But I do not wish to kill any of them," I replied. "Why should I?" "Why not?" he insisted. "They would have killed you when they had you prisoner. They would kill you now if they could get their hands on you, and they would eat you into the bargain. But I know why you do not try it. It is because you have spoken lies. Your weapon will not kill at a great distance. It is only a queerly wrought club. For all I know, you are nothing more than a lowly Bo lu." "Why should you wish me to kill your own people?" I asked. "They are no longer my people," he replied proudly. "Last night, in the very middle of the night, the call came to me. Like that it came into my head," and he struck his hands together smartly once, "that I had risen. I have been waiting for it and expecting it for a long time. Today I am a Kro lu. Today I go into the cos-lu-pak, unpeopled country, or literally no man's land, between the Band-lu and the Kro-lu, and there I fashion my bow and my arrows and my shield. There I hunt the red deer for the leathern jerkin which is the badge of my new estate. When these things are done, I can go to the chief of the Kro-lu, and he dare not refuse me. That is why you may kill those low Band-lu if you wish to live, for I am in a hurry." "But why do you wish to kill me?" I asked. He looked puzzled and finally gave it up. "I do not know," he admitted. "It is the way in Caspak. If we do not kill, we shall be killed. Therefore it is wise to kill first whomever does not belong to one's own people. This morning I hid in my cave till the others were gone upon the hunt, for I knew that they would know at once that I had become a Kro-lu and would kill me. They will kill me if they find me in the cos-lu-pak. So will the Kro-lu if they come upon me before I have won my Kro-lu weapons and jerkin. You would kill me if you could, and that is the reason I know that you speak lies when you say that your weapons will kill at a great distance. Would they, you would long since have killed me. Come, I have no more time to waste in words. I will spare the woman and take her with me to the Kro-lu, for she is comely." And with that he advanced upon me with raised spear. My rifle was at my hip at the ready. He was so close that I did not need to raise it to my shoulder, having but to pull the trigger to send him into kingdom come whenever I chose. But yet I hesitated. It was difficult to bring myself to take a human life. I could feel no enmity toward this savage barbarian who acted almost as wholly upon instinct as might a wild beast, and to the last moment I was determined to seek some way to avoid what now seemed inevitable. Ajor stood at my shoulder, her knife ready in her hand, and a sneer on her lips at his suggestion that he would take her with him. Just as I thought I should have to fire, a chorus of screams broke from the women beneath us. I saw the man halt and glance downward, and following his example, my eyes took in the panic and its cause. The women had evidently been quitting the pool and slowly returning toward the caves when they were confronted by a monstrous cave lion which stood directly between them and their cliffs in the center of the narrow path that led down to the pool among the tumbled rocks. Screaming, the women were rushing madly back to the pool. "It will do them no good," remarked the man, a trace of excitement in his voice. "It will do them no good, for the lion will wait until they come out and take as many as he can carry away. And there is one there," he added, a trace of sadness in his tone, "whom I hoped would soon follow me to the Kro-lu. Together have we come up from the beginning." He raised his spear above his head and poised it, ready to hurl downward at the lion. "She is nearest to him," he muttered. "He will get her, and she will never come to me among the Kro-lu, or even thereafter. It is useless. No warrior lives who could hurl a weapon so great a distance." But even as he spoke, I was leveling my rifle upon the great brute below, and as he ceased speaking, I squeezed the trigger. My bullet must have struck to a hair the point at which I had aimed, for it smashed the brute's spine back of his shoulders and tore on through his heart, dropping him dead in his tracks. For a moment the women were as terrified by the report of the rifle as they had been by the menace of the lion; but when they saw that the loud noise had evidently destroyed their enemy, they came creeping cautiously back to examine the carcass. The man toward whom I had immediately turned after firing, lest he should pursue his threatened attack, stood staring at me in amazement and admiration. "Why," he asked, "if you could do that, did you not kill me long before?" "I told you," I replied, "that I had no quarrel with you. I do not care to kill men with whom I have no quarrel." But he could not seem to get the idea through his head. "I can believe now that you are not of Caspak," he admitted, "for no Caspakian would have permitted such an opportunity to escape him." This, however, I found later to be an exaggeration, as the tribes of the west coast and even the Kro lu of the east coast are far less bloodthirsty than he would have had me believe. "And your weapon," he continued. "You spoke true words when I thought you spoke lies." And then suddenly, "Let us be friends." I turned to Ajor. "Can I trust him?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "Why not? Has he not asked to be friends?" I was not at the time well enough acquainted with Caspakian ways to know that truthfulness and loyalty are two of the strongest characteristics of these primitive people. They are not sufficiently cultured to have become adept in hypocrisy, treason and dissimulation. There are, of course, a few exceptions. "We can go north together," continued the warrior. "I will fight for you and you can fight for me. Until death will I serve you, for you have saved So al, whom I had given up as dead." He threw down his spear and covered both his eyes with the palms of his two hands. I looked inquiringly toward Ajor, who explained, as best she could, that this was the form of the Caspakian oath of allegiance. "You need never fear him after this," she concluded. "What should I do?" I asked. "Take his hands down from before his eyes and return his spear to him," she explained. I did as she bade, and the man seemed very pleased. I then asked what I should have done had I not wished to accept his friendship. They told me that had I walked away, the moment that I was out of sight of the warrior, we would have become deadly enemies again. "But I could so easily have killed him as he stood there defenseless!" I exclaimed. "Yes," replied the warrior, "but no man with good sense blinds his eyes before one whom he does not trust." It was rather a decent compliment, and it taught me just how much I might rely on the loyalty of my new friend. I was glad to have him with us, for he knew the country and was evidently a fearless warrior. I wished that I might have recruited a battalion like him. As the women were now approaching the cliffs, Tomar, the warrior, suggested that we make our way to the valley before they could intercept us, as they might attempt to detain us and were almost certain to set upon Ajor. So we hastened down the narrow path, reaching the foot of the cliffs but a short distance ahead of the women. They called after us to stop, but we kept on at a rapid walk, not wishing to have any trouble with them, which could only result in the death of some of them. We had proceeded about a mile when we heard some one behind us calling Tomar by name, and when we stopped and looked around, we saw a woman running rapidly toward us. As she approached nearer, I could see that she was a very comely creature, and like all her sex that I had seen in Caspak, apparently young. "It is So al!" exclaimed Tomar. "Is she mad that she follows me thus?" In another moment the young woman stopped, panting before us. She paid not the slightest attention to Ajor or me, but devouring Tomar with her sparkling eyes, she cried, "I have risen! I have risen!" "So al!" was all that the man could say. "Yes," she went on, "the call came to me just before I quit the pool; but I did not know that it had come to you. I can see it in your eyes. Tomar, my Tomar, we shall go on together." And she threw herself into his arms. It was a very affecting sight, for it was evident that these two had been mates for a long time, and that they had each thought that they were about to be separated by that strange law of evolution which holds good in Caspak and which was slowly unfolding before my incredulous mind. I did not then comprehend even a tithe of the wondrous process which goes on eternally within the confines of Caprona's barrier cliffs, nor am I any too sure that I do even now. Tomar explained to So al that it was I who had killed the cave lion and saved her life, and that Ajor was my woman and thus entitled to the same loyalty which was my due. At first Ajor and So al were like a couple of stranger cats on a back fence, but soon they began to accept each other under something of an armed truce, and later became fast friends. So was a mighty fine looking girl, built like a tigress as to strength and sinuosity, but withal sweet and womanly. Ajor and I came to be very fond of her, and she was, I think, equally fond of us. Tomar was very much of a man, a savage if you will, but none the less a man. Finding that traveling in company with Tomar made our journey both easier and safer, Ajor and I did not continue on our way alone while the novitiates delayed their approach to the Kro lu country in order that they might properly fit themselves in the matter of arms and apparel, but remained with them. Thus we became well acquainted, to such an extent that we looked forward with regret to the day when we took our places among their new comrades and we should be forced to continue upon our way alone. It was a matter of much concern to Tomar that the Kro lu would undoubtedly not receive Ajor and me in a friendly manner, and that consequently we should have to avoid these people. It would have been very helpful to us could we have made friends with them, as their country abutted directly upon that of the Galus. Their friendship would have meant that Ajor's dangers were practically past, and that I had accomplished fully one half of my long journey. In view of what I had passed through, I often wondered what chance I had to complete that journey in search of my friends. The further south I should travel on the west side of the island, the more frightful would the dangers become as I neared the stamping grounds of the more hideous reptilia and the haunts of the Alus and the Ho lu, all of which were at the southern half of the island. And then, if I should not find the members of my party, what was to become of me? I could not live for long in any portion of Caspak with which I was familiar. The moment my ammunition was exhausted, I should be as good as dead. There was a chance that the Galus would receive me, but even Ajor could not say definitely whether they would or not, and even provided that they would, could I retrace my steps from the beginning after failing to find my own people and return to the far northern land of Galus? I doubted it. However, I was learning from Ajor, who was more or less of a fatalist, a philosophy which was as necessary in Caspak to peace of mind as is faith to the devout Christian of the outer world. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the People That Time Forgot. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The People That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 5. We were sitting before a little fire inside a safe grotto one night, shortly after we had quit the cliff dwellings of the Band lu, when So-al raised a question which it had never occurred to me to propound to Ajor. She asked her why she had left her own people and how she had come so far south as the country of the Alus, where I had found her. At first Ajor hesitated to explain, but at last she consented, and for the first time I heard the complete story of her origin and experiences. For my benefit she entered into greater detail of explanation than would have been necessary had I been a native Caspakian. "I am a cos-ata-lo," commenced Ajor, and then she turned toward me. "A cos-ata-lo, my Tom, is a woman, lo, who did not come from an egg, and thus on up from the beginning. Cors-va-sho. I was a babe at my mother's breast. Only among the Galus are such, and then but infrequently. The Wieroo get most of us, but my mother hid me until I had attained such size that the Wieroo could not readily distinguish me from one who had come up from the beginning. I knew both my mother and my father, as only such as I may. My father is high chief among the Galus. His name is Jor, and both he and my mother came up from the beginning. But one of them, probably my mother, had completed the 7 cycles, approximately 700 years, with the result that their offspring might be cos-ata-lo, or born as are all the children of your race, my Tom, as you tell me is the fact. I was therefore apart from my fellows in that my children would probably be as I, of a higher state of evolution, and so I was sought by the men of my people; but none of them appealed to me. I cared for none. The most persistent was Du seen, a huge warrior of whom my father stood in considerable fear, since it was quite possible that Du seen could wrest from him his chieftainship of the Galus. He has a large following of the newer Galus, those most recently come up from the Kro lu, and as this class is usually much more powerful numerically than the older Galus, and as Du seen's ambition knows no bounds, we have for a long time been expecting him to find some excuse for a break with Jor, the high chief, my father. A further complication lay in the fact that Du seen wanted me, while I would have none of him, and then came evidence to my father's ears that he was in league with the Wieroo. A hunter returning late at night came trembling to my father, saying that he had seen Du seen talking with a Wieroo in a lonely spot far from the village, and that plainly he had heard the words: "If you will help me, I will help you. I will deliver into your hands all cos ata lo among the Galus, now and hereafter; but for that service you must slay Jor, the high chief, and bring terror and confusion to his followers." Now when my father heard this, he was angry, but he was also afraid afraid for me, who am cos ata lo. He called me to him and told me what he had heard, pointing out two ways in which we might frustrate Du seen. The first was that I go to Du seen as his mate, after which he would be loath to give me into the hands of the Wieroo, or to further abide by the wicked compact he had made, a compact which would doom his own offspring, who would doubtless be as am I, their mother. The alternative was flight until Du seen should have been overcome and punished. I chose the latter and fled toward the south. Beyond the confines of the Galu country is little danger from the Wieroo, who seek ordinarily only Galus of the highest orders. There are two excellent reasons for this. One is that from the beginning of time jealousy had existed between the Wieroo and the Galus as to which would eventually dominate the world. It seems generally conceded that that race which first reaches a point of evolution which permits them to produce young of their own species and of both sexes must dominate all other creatures. The Wieroo first began to produce their own kind, after which evolution from Galu to Wieroo ceased gradually until now it is unknown. But the Wieroo produce only males, which is why they steal our female young, and by stealing cos ata lo they increase their own chances of eventually reproducing both sexes and at the same time lessen ours. Already the Galus produce both male and female, but so carefully do the Wieroo watch us that few of the males ever grow to manhood, while even fewer are the females that are not stolen away. It is indeed a strange condition, for while our greatest enemies hate and fear us, they dare not exterminate us, knowing that they too would become extinct but for us. Ah, but could we once get a start, I am sure that when all were true cos ata lo, there would have been evolved at last the true dominant race, before which all the world would be forced to bow. Ajor always spoke of the world as though nothing existed beyond Caspak. She could not seem to grasp the truth of my origin, or the fact that there were countless other peoples outside her stern barrier cliffs. She apparently felt that I came from an entirely different world. Where it was and how I came to Caspak from it were matters quite beyond her, with which she refused to trouble her pretty head. "Well," she continued, "and so I ran away to hide, intending to pass the cliffs to the south of Galu and find a retreat in the Kro lu country. It would be dangerous, but there seemed no other way. The third night I took refuge in a large cave in the cliffs at the edge of my own country. Upon the following day I would cross over into the Kro lu country, where I felt that I should be reasonably safe from the Wieroo, though menaced by countless other dangers. However, to a cos ata lo any fate is preferable to that of falling into the clutches of the frightful Wieroo, from whose land none returns. I had been sleeping peacefully for several hours when I was awakened by a slight noise within the cavern, The moon was shining brightly, illumining the entrance against which I saw silhouetted the dread figure of a Wieroo. There was no escape. The cave was shallow, the entrance narrow. I lay very still, hoping against hope that the creature had but paused here to rest and might soon depart without discovering me. Yet all the while I knew that he came seeking me. I waited, scarce breathing, watching the thing creep stealthily toward me, its great eyes luminous in the darkness of the cave's interior, and at last I knew that those eyes were directed upon me, for the Wieroo can see in the darkness better than even the lion or the tiger. But a few feet separated us when I sprang to my feet and dashed madly toward my menacer in a vain effort to dodge past him and reach the outside world. It was madness, of course, for even had I succeeded temporarily, the Wieroo would have but followed and swooped down upon me from above. As it was, he reached forth and seized me, and though I struggled, he overpowered me. In the duel, his long white robe was nearly torn from him, and he became very angry, so that he trembled and beat his wings together in his rage. He asked me my name, but I would not answer him, and that angered him still more. At last he dragged me to the entrance of the cave, lifted me in his arms, spread his great wings, and leaping into the air, flapped dismally through the night. I saw the moonlit landscape sliding away beneath me, and then we were out above the sea and on our way to Oo-oh, the country of the Wieroo. The dim outlines of Oo-oh were unfolding below us when there came from above a loud whirring of giant wings. The Wieroo and I glanced up simultaneously to see a pair of huge jo-oos, flying reptiles, pterodactyls, swooping down upon us. The Wieroo wheeled and dropped almost to sea level, and then raced southward in an effort to outdistance our pursuers. The great creatures, notwithstanding their enormous weight, are swift on their wings, but the Wieroo are swifter. Even with my added weight, the creature that bore me maintained his lead, though he could not increase it. Faster than the fastest wind, we raced through the night, southward along the coast. Sometimes we rose to great heights, where the air was chill and the world below but a blur of dim outlines, but always the jo-oos stuck behind us. I knew that we had covered a great distance, for the rush of the wind by my face attested the speed of our progress. But I had no idea where we were when at last I realized that the Wieroo was weakening. One of the jo-oos gained on us and succeeded in heading us, so that my captor had to turn in toward the coast. Further and further they forced him to the left. Lower and lower he sank. More labored was his breathing, and weaker the stroke of his once powerful wings. We were not 10 feet above the ground when they overtook us and at the edge of a forest. One of them seized the Wieroo by his right wing, and in an effort to free himself, he loosed his grasp upon me, dropping me to the earth. Like a frightened ecca, I leaped to my feet and raced for the sheltering sanctuary of the forest, where I knew neither could follow or seize me. Then I turned and looked back to see two great reptiles tear my abductor asunder and devour him on the spot. I was saved, yet I felt that I was lost. How far I was from the country of the Galus I could not guess, nor did it seem probable that I ever could make my way in safety to my native land. Day was breaking. Soon the carnivora would stalk forth for their first kill. I was armed only with my knife. About me was a strange landscape. The flowers, the trees, the grasses even, were different from those of my northern world, and presently there appeared before me a creature fully as hideous as the Wieroo, a hairy man-thing that barely walked erect. I shuddered, and then I fled. Through the hideous dangers that my forebears had endured in the early stages of their human evolution I fled, and always pursuing was the hairy monster that had discovered me. Later he was joined by others of his kind. They were the speechless men, the Alus, from whom you rescued me, my Tom. From then on you know the story of my adventures, and from the first I would endure them all again because they led me to you." It was very nice of her to say that, and I appreciated it. I felt that she was a mighty nice little girl whose friendship anyone might be glad to have. but I wished that when she touched me those peculiar thrills would not run through me. It was most discomforting, because it reminded me of love, and I knew that I never could love this half-baked little barbarian. I was very much interested in her account of the Wieroo, which up to this time I had considered a purely mythological creature, but Ajor shuddered so at even the veriest mention of the name that I was loath to press the subject upon her, and so the Wieroo still remained a mystery to me. While the Wieroo interested me greatly, I had little time to think about them, as our waking hours were filled with the necessities of existence, the constant battle for survival which is the chief occupation of Caspakians. To-mar and So-al were now about fitted for their advent into Kro-lu society, and must therefore leave us, as we could not accompany them without incurring great danger ourselves and running the chance of endangering them. But each swore to be always our friend, and assured us that should we need their aid at any time, we had but to ask it. Nor could I doubt their sincerity, since we had been so instrumental in bringing them safely upon their journey toward the Kro-lu village. This was our last day together. In the afternoon we should separate, To-mar and So-al going directly to the Kro-lu village, while Ajor and I made a detour to avoid a conflict with the archers. The former both showed evidence of nervous apprehension as the time approached for them to make their entry into the village of their new people, and yet both were very proud and happy. They told us that they would be well received, as additions to a tribe always are welcomed, and the more so as the distance from the beginning increased, the higher tribes or races being far weaker numerically than the lower. The southern end of the island fairly swarms with the Ho-lu or apes. Next above these are the Alus, who are slightly fewer in number than the Ho-lu, and again there are fewer Bo-hu than Alus, and fewer Sto-lu than Bo-lu. Thus it goes until the Kro-lu are fewer in number than any of the others, and here the law reverses, for the Galus outnumber the Kro-lu. As Ajor explained it to me, the reason for this is that as evolution practically ceases with the Galus, there is no less among them on this score, for even the cos-ata-lo are still considered Galus and remain with them, and Galus come up both from the west and east coasts. There are, too, fewer carnivorous reptiles at the north end of the island, and not so many of the great and ferocious members of the cat family as take their hideous toll of life among the races further south. By now I was obtaining some idea of the Caspakian scheme of evolution, which partly accounted for the lack of young among the races I had so far seen. Coming up from the beginning, the Caspakian passes, during a single existence, through the various stages of evolution, or at least many of them through which the human race has passed during the countless ages since life first stirred upon a new world. But the question which continued to puzzle me was, what creates life at the beginning, Cor-sva-jo? I had noticed that as we traveled northward from the Alus' country, the land had gradually risen until we were now several hundred feet above the level of the inland sea. Ajor told me that the Galus' country was still higher and considerably colder, which accounted for the scarcity of reptiles. The change in form and kinds of the lower animals was even more marked than the evolutionary stages of man. The diminutive eka, or small horse, became a rough-coated and sturdy little pony in the Kro-lu country. I saw a greater number of small lions and tigers, though many of the huge ones still persisted, while the woolly mammoth was more in evidence, as were several varieties of the labyrinthodonta. These creatures, from which, God save me, I should have expected to find further south, but for some unaccountable reason they gain their greatest bulk in the Kro-lu and Galu countries, though fortunately they are rare. I rather imagine that they are a very early life which is rapidly nearing extinction in Caspak, though wherever they are found they constitute a menace to all forms of life. It was mid-afternoon when To-mar and So-al bade us good bye. We were not far from Kro-lu village. In fact, we had approached it much closer than we had intended, and now Ajor and I were to make a detour toward the sea, while our companions went directly in search of the Kro-lu chief. Ajor and I had gone perhaps a mile or two and were just about to emerge from a dense wood when I saw that ahead of us which caused me to draw back into concealment, at the same time pushing Ajor behind me. What I saw was a party of Band lu warriors, large, fierce appearing men. From the direction of their march I saw that they were returning to their caves, and that if we remained where we were, they would pass without discovering us. Presently Ajor nudged me. "They have a prisoner," she whispered. "He is Kro lu." And then I saw him, the first fully developed Kro lu I had seen. He was a fine looking savage, tall and straight, with a regal carriage. To-mar was a handsome fellow, but this Kro lu showed plainly in his every physical attribute a higher plane of evolution. While To-mar was just entering the Kro lu sphere, this man, it seemed to me, must be close indeed to the next stage of his development, which would see him an envied Galu. "They will kill him?" I whispered to Ajor. "The dance of death," she replied, and I shuddered, so recently had I escaped the same fate. It seemed cruel that one who must have passed safely up through all the frightful stages of human evolution within Caspak should die at the very foot of his goal. I raised my rifle to my shoulder and took careful aim at one of the Band lu. If I hit him, I would hit two, for another was directly behind the first. Ajor touched my arm. "What would you do?" she asked. "They are all our enemies." "I am going to save them from the dance of death," I replied, "enemy or no enemy," and I squeezed the trigger. At the report, the two Band lu lunged forward upon their faces. I handed my rifle to Ajor and drawing my pistol, stepped out in full view of the startled party. The Band lu did not run away as had some of the lower orders of Caspakians at the sound of the rifle. Instead, the moment they saw me, they let out a series of demoniac war cries, and raising their spears above their heads, charged me. The Kro lu stood silent and statuesque, watching the proceedings. He made no attempt to escape, though his feet were not bound and none of the warriors remained to guard him. There were 10 of the Band lu coming for me. I dropped 3 of them with my pistol as rapidly as a man might count 3, and then my rifle spoke close to my left shoulder, and another of them stumbled and rolled over and over upon the ground. Plucky little Ajor! She had never fired a shot before in all her life, though I had taught her to sight and aim, and how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. She had practiced these new accomplishments often, but little had I thought they would make a marksman of her so quickly. With 6 of their fellows put out of the fight so easily, the remaining 6 sought cover behind some low bushes and commenced a council of war. I wished that they would go away, as I had no ammunition to waste, and I was fearful that should they institute another charge, some of them would reach us, for they were already quite close. Suddenly one of them rose and launched his spear. It was the most marvelous exhibition of speed I have ever witnessed. It seemed to me that he had scarce gained an upright position when the weapon was halfway upon its journey, speeding like an arrow toward Ajor. And then it was, with that little life in danger, that I made the best shot I have ever made in my life. I took no conscious aim. It was as though my subconscious mind, impelled by a stronger power even than that of self-preservation, directed my hand. Ajor was in danger. Simultaneously with the thought, my pistol flew to position. A streak of incandescent powder marked the path of the bullet from its muzzle, and the spear, its point shattered, was deflected from its path. With a howl of dismay, the 6 Band lu rose from their shelter and raced away toward the south. I turned toward Ajor. She was very white and wide-eyed, for the clutching fingers of death had all but seized her. But a little smile came to her lips and an expression of great pride to her eyes. "My Tom," she said, and took my hand in hers. That was all. "My Tom," and a pressure of the hand. Her Tom? Something stirred within my bosom. Was it exultation or was it consternation? Impossible! I turned away almost brusquely. "Come," I said, and strode off toward the Kro lu prisoner. The Kro lu stood watching us with stolid indifference. I presume that he expected to be killed, but if he did, he showed no outward sign of fear. His eyes, indicating his greatest interest, were fixed upon my pistol or the rifle which Ajor still carried. I cut his bonds with my knife. As I did so, an expression of surprise tinged and animated the haughty reserve of his countenance. He eyed me quizzically. "What are you going to do with me?" he asked. "You are free," I replied. "Go home if you wish." "Why don't you kill me?" he inquired. "I am defenseless." "Why should I kill you? I have risked my life and that of this young lady to save your life. Why, therefore, should I now take it?" Of course I didn't say "young lady," as there is no Caspakian equivalent for that term, but I have to allow myself considerable latitude in the translation of Caspakian conversations. To speak always of a beautiful young girl as a "she" may be literal, but it seems far from gallant. The Kro lu concentrated his steady, level gaze upon me for at least a full minute. Then he spoke again. "Who are you, man of strange skins?" he asked. "Your she is Galu; but you are neither Galu, nor Kro lu, nor Band lu, nor any other sort of man which I have seen before. Tell me from whence comes so mighty a warrior and so generous a foe." "It is a long story," I replied, "but suffice it to say that I am not of Caspak. I am a stranger here, and, let this sink in, I am not a foe. I have no wish to be an enemy of any man in Caspak, with the possible exception of the Galu warrior Du seen." "Du seen!" he exclaimed. "You are an enemy of Du seen? And why?" "Because he would harm Ajor," I replied. "You know him?" "He cannot know him," said Ajor. "Du seen rose from the Kro lu long ago, taking a new name, as all do when they enter a new sphere. He cannot know him, as there is no intercourse between the Kro lu and the Galu." The warrior smiled. "Du seen rose not so long ago," he said, "that I do not recall him well, and recently he has taken it upon himself to abrogate the ancient laws of Caspak. He had had intercourse with the Kro lu. Du seen would be chief of the Galus, and he has come to the Kro lu for help." Ajor was aghast. The thing was incredible. Never had Kro lu and Galu had friendly relations. By the savage laws of Caspak they were deadly enemies, for only so can the several races maintain their individuality. "Will the Kro lu join him?" asked Ajor. "Will they invade the country of Jor, my father?" "The younger Kro lu favor the plan," replied the warrior, "since they believe they will thus become Galus immediately. They hope to span the long years of change through which they must pass in the ordinary course of events and at a single stride become Galus. We of the older Kro lu tell them that though they occupy the land of the Galu and wear the skins and ornaments of the golden people, still they will not be Galus till the time arrives that they are ripe to rise. We also tell them that even then they will never become a true Galu race, since there will still be those among them who can never rise. It is all right to raid the Galu country occasionally for plunder, as our people do, but to attempt to conquer it and hold it is madness. For my part, I have been content to wait until the call came to me. I feel that it cannot now be long." "What is your name?" asked Ajor. "Chal-az," replied the man. "You are chief of the Kro lu?" Ajor continued. "No, it is Al-tan who is chief of the Kro lu of the east," answered Chal-az. "And he is against this plan to invade my father's country?" "Unfortunately, he is rather in favor of it," replied the man, "since he has about come to the conclusion that he is Batu. He has been chief ever since before I came up from the Band lu, and I can see no change in him in all those years. In fact, he still appears to be more Band lu than Kro lu. However, he is a good chief and a mighty warrior, and if Du seen persuades him to his cause, the Galus may find themselves under a Kro lu chieftain before long, Du seen as well as the others, for Al-tan would never consent to occupy a subordinate position, and once he plants a victorious foot in Galu, he will not withdraw it without a struggle." I asked them what Batu meant, as I had not before heard the word. Literally translated, it is equivalent to through, finished, done for, as applied to an individual's evolutionary progress in Caspak. And with this information was developed the interesting fact that not every individual is capable of rising through every stage to that of Galu. Some never progress beyond the Alu stage. Others stop at Bo-lu, as Sto-lu, as Band-lu, or as Kro-lu. The Ho-lu of the first generation may rise to become Alus. The Alus of the second generation may become Bo-lu, while it requires 3 generations of Bo-lu to become Band-lu, and so on until Kro-lu's parent on one side must be of the 6th generation. It was not entirely plain to me even with this explanation, since I couldn't understand how there could be different generations of peoples who apparently had no offspring. Yet I was commencing to get a slight glimmer of the strange laws which govern propagation and evolution in this weird land. Already I knew that the warm pools which always lie close to every tribal abiding place were closely linked with the Caspakian scheme of evolution, and that the daily immersion of the females in the greenish slimy water was in response to some natural law, since neither pleasure nor cleanliness could be derived from what seemed almost a religious rite. Yet I was still at sea, nor seemingly could Ajor enlighten me, since she was compelled to use words which I could not understand and which it was impossible for her to explain the meanings of. As we stood talking, we were suddenly startled by a commotion in the bushes and among the boles of the trees surrounding us, and simultaneously 100 Kro-lu warriors appeared in a rough circle about us. They greeted Chal-az with a volley of questions as they approached slowly from all sides, their heavy bows fitted with long, sharp arrows. Upon Ajor and me they looked with covetousness in the one instance and suspicion in the other; but after they had heard Chal-az's story, their attitude was more friendly. A huge savage did all the talking. He was a mountain of a man, yet perfectly proportioned. "This is Al-tan the chief," said Chal-az by way of introduction. Then he told something of my story, and Al-tan asked me many questions of the land from which I came. The warriors crowded around close to hear my replies, and there were many expressions of incredulity as I spoke of what was to them another world, of the yacht which had brought me over vast waters, and of the plane that had borne me Jo-oo like over the summit of the barrier cliffs. It was the mention of the hydroaeroplane which precipitated the first outspoken skepticism, and then Ajor came to my defense. "I saw it with my own eyes," she exclaimed. "I saw him flying through the air in battle with a Jo-oo. The Alus were chasing me, and they saw and ran away." "Who is this she?" demanded Al-tan suddenly, his eyes fixed fiercely upon Ajor. For a moment there was silence. Ajor looked up at me, a hurt and questioning expression on her face. "Whose she is this?" repeated Al-tan. "She is mine," I replied, though what force it was that impelled me to say it I could not have told; but an instant later I was glad that I had spoken the words, for the reward of Ajor's proud and happy face was reward indeed. Al-tan eyed her for several minutes, and then turned to me. "Can you keep her?" he asked, just the tinge of a sneer upon his face. I laid my palm upon the grip of my pistol and answered that I could. He saw the move, glanced at the butt of the automatic where it protruded from its holster, and smiled. Then he turned, and raising his great bow, fitted an arrow and drew the shaft far back. His warriors, supercilious smiles upon their faces, stood silently watching him. His bow was the longest and the heaviest among them all. A mighty man indeed must he be to bend it. Yet Al-tan drew the shaft back until the stone point touched his left forefinger, and he did it with consummate ease. Then he raised the shaft to the level of his right eye, held it there for an instant, and released it. When the arrow stopped, half its length protruded from the opposite side of a 6-inch tree 50 feet away. Al-tan and his warriors turned toward me with expressions of immense satisfaction upon their faces, and then, apparently for Ajor's benefit, the chieftain swaggered to and fro a couple of times, swinging his great arms and his bulky shoulders for all the world like a drunken prize fighter at a beach dance hall. I saw that some reply was necessary, and so in a single motion I drew my gun, dropped it on the still quivering arrow, and pulled the trigger. At the sound of the report, the Kro-lu leaped back and raised their weapons, but as I was smiling, they took heart and lowered them again. Following my eyes to the tree, the shaft of their chief was gone, and through the bole was a little round hole marking the path of my bullet. It was a good shot, if I do say it myself, as shouldn't, but necessity must have guided that bullet. I simply had to make a good shot, that I might immediately establish my position among those savage and warlike Caspakians of the sixth sphere. That it had its effect was immediately noticeable, but I am none too sure that it helped my cause with Al tan. Whereas he might have condescended to tolerate me as a harmless and interesting curiosity, he now, by the change in his expression, appeared to consider me in a new and unfavorable light. Nor can I wonder, knowing this type as I did, for had I not made him ridiculous in the eyes of his warriors, beating him at his own game? What king, savage or civilized, could condone such impudence? Seeing his black scowls, I deemed it expedient, especially on Ajor's account, to terminate the interview and continue upon our way. But when I would have done so, Al tan detained us with a gesture, and his warriors pressed around us. "What is the meaning of this?" I demanded, and before Al tan could reply, Chal az raised his voice in our behalf. "Is this the gratitude of a Kro lu chieftain, Al tan," he asked, "to one who has served you by saving one of your warriors from the enemy, saving him from the death dance of the Band lu?" Al tan was silent for a moment, and then his brow cleared, and the faint imitation of a pleasant expression struggled for existence as he said: "The stranger will not be harmed. I wished only to detain him that he may be feasted tonight in the village of Al tan the Kro lu. In the morning he may go his way. Al tan will not hinder him." I was not entirely reassured, but I wanted to see the interior of the Kro lu village, and anyway I knew that if Al tan intended treachery, I would be no more in his power in the morning than I now was. In fact, during the night I might find opportunity to escape with Ajor, while at the instant neither of us could hope to escape unscathed from the encircling warriors. Therefore, in order to disarm him of any thought that I might entertain suspicion as to his sincerity, I promptly and courteously accepted his invitation. His satisfaction was evident, and as we set off toward his village, he walked beside me, asking many questions as to the country from which I came, its peoples and their customs. He seemed much mystified by the fact that we could walk abroad by day or night without fear of being devoured by wild beasts or savage reptiles, and when I told him of the great armies which we maintained, his simple mind could not grasp the fact that they existed solely for the slaughtering of human beings. "I am glad," he said, "that I do not dwell in your country among such savage peoples. Here in Caspak men fight with men when they meet, men of different races, but their weapons are first for the slaying of beasts in the chase and in defense. We do not fashion weapons solely for the killing of man as do your peoples. Your country must indeed be a savage country, from which you are fortunate to have escaped to the peace and security of Caspak." Here was a new and refreshing viewpoint, nor could I take exception to it after what I had told Al tan of the great war which had been raging in Europe for over 2 years before I left home. On the march to the Kro lu village we were continually stalked by innumerable beasts of prey, and 3 times we were attacked by frightful creatures; but Al tan took it all as a matter of course, rushing forward with raised spear or sending a heavy shaft into the body of the attacker, and then returning to our conversation as though no interruption had occurred. Twice were members of his band mauled, and one was killed by a huge and bellicose rhinoceros; but the instant the action was over, it was as though it never had occurred. The dead man was stripped of his belongings and left where he had died. The carnivora would take care of his burial. The trophies that these Kro lu left to the meat eaters would have turned an English big game hunter green with envy. They did, it is true, cut all the edible parts from the rhino and carry them home, but already they were pretty well weighted down with the spoils of the chase, and only the fact that they are particularly fond of rhino meat caused them to do so. They left the hide on the pieces they selected, as they use it for sandals, shield covers, the hilts of their knives, and various other purposes where tough hide is desirable. I was much interested in their shields, especially after I saw one used in defense against the attack of a saber-toothed tiger. The huge creature had charged us without warning from a clump of dense bushes where it was lying up after eating. It was met with an avalanche of spears, some of which passed entirely through its body, with such force were they hurled. The charge was from a very short distance, requiring the use of the spear rather than the bow and arrow; but after the launching of the spears, the men not directly in the path of the charge sent bolt after bolt into the great carcass with almost incredible rapidity. The beast, screaming with pain and rage, bore down upon Chal az, while I stood helpless with my rifle for fear of hitting one of the warriors who were closing in upon it. But Chal az was ready. Throwing aside his bow, he crouched behind his large oval shield, in the center of which was a hole about 6 inches in diameter. The shield was held by tight loops to his left arm, while in his right hand he grasped his heavy knife. Bristling with spears and arrows, the great cat hurled itself upon the shield, and down went Chal az upon his back with the shield entirely covering him. The tiger clawed and bit at the heavy rhinoceros hide with which the shield was faced, while Chal az, through the round hole in the shield's center, plunged his blade repeatedly into the vitals of the savage animal. Doubtless the battle would have gone to Chal az even though I had not interfered; but the moment that I saw a clean opening, with no Kro lu beyond, I raised my rifle and killed the beast. When Chal az arose, he glanced at the sky and remarked that it looked like rain. The others already had resumed the march toward the village. The incident was closed. For some unaccountable reason, the whole thing reminded me of a friend who once shot a cat in his backyard. For 3 weeks he talked of nothing else. It was almost dark when we reached the village, a large palisaded enclosure of several hundred leaf-thatched huts set in groups of from 2 to 7. The huts were hexagonal in form, and where grouped were joined so that they resembled the cells of a beehive. One hut meant a warrior and his mate, and each additional hut in a group indicated an additional female. The palisade which surrounded the village was of logs set close together and woven into a solid wall with tough creepers which were planted at their base and trained to weave in and out to bind the logs together. The logs slanted outward at an angle of about 30 degrees, in which position they were held by shorter logs embedded in the ground at right angles to them, and with their upper ends supporting the longer pieces a trifle above their centers of equilibrium. Along the top of the palisade, sharpened stakes had been driven at all sorts of angles. The only opening into the enclosure was through a small aperture 3 feet wide and 3 feet high, which was closed from the inside by logs about 6 feet long, laid horizontally one upon another, between the inside face of the palisade and 2 other braced logs which paralleled the face of the wall upon the inside. As we entered the village, we were greeted by a not unfriendly crowd of curious warriors and women, to whom Chal az generously explained the service we had rendered him, whereupon they showered us with the most well-meant attentions, for Chal az, it seemed, was a most popular member of the tribe. Necklaces of lion and tiger teeth, bits of dried meat, finely tanned hides, and earthen pots, beautifully decorated, they thrust upon us until we were loaded down, and all the while Al tan glared balefully upon us, seemingly jealous of the attentions heaped upon us because we had served Chal az. At last we reached a hut that they set apart for us, and there we cooked our meat and some vegetables the women brought us, and had milk from cows, the first I had had in Caspak, and cheese from the milk of wild goats, with honey and thin bread made from wheat flour of their own grinding, and grapes and the fermented juice of grapes. It was quite the most wonderful meal I had eaten since I quit the Toreador and Bowen Tyler's colored chef, who could make pork chops taste like chicken and chicken taste like heaven. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The People That Time Forgot. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The People That Time Forgot. By Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 6. After dinner I rolled a cigarette and stretched myself at ease upon a pile of furs before the doorway, with Ajor's head pillowed in my lap and a feeling of great content pervading me. It was the first time since my plane had topped the barrier cliffs of Caspak that I had felt any sense of peace or security. My hand wandered to the velvet cheek of the girl I had claimed as mine, and to her luxuriant hair and the golden fillet which bound it close to her shapely head. Her slender fingers groping upward sought mine and drew them to her lips, and then I gathered her in my arms and crushed her to me, smothering her mouth with a long, long kiss. It was the first time that passion had tinged my intercourse with Ajor. We were alone, and the hut was ours until morning. But now from beyond the palisade, in the direction of the main gate, came the hallooing of men and the answering calls and queries of the guard. We listened. Returning hunters, no doubt. We heard them enter the village amidst the barking dogs. I have forgotten to mention the dogs of Kro lu. The village swarmed with them, gaunt, wolf-like creatures that guarded the herd by day when it grazed without the palisade, 10 dogs to a cow. By night the cows were herded in an outer enclosure roofed against the onslaughts of the carnivorous cats, and the dogs, with the exception of a few, were brought into the village. These few well-tested brutes remained with the herd. During the day they fed plentifully upon the beasts of prey which they killed in protection of the herd, so that their keep amounted to nothing at all. Shortly after the commotion at the gate had subsided, Ajor and I arose to enter the hut, and at the same time a warrior appeared from one of the twisted alleys which, lying between the irregularly placed huts and groups of huts, formed the streets of the Kro lu village. The fellow halted before us and addressed me, saying that Al tan desired my presence at his hut. The wording of the invitation and the manner of the messenger threw me entirely off my guard, so cordial was the one and respectful the other, and the result was that I went willingly, telling Ajor that I would return presently. I had laid my arms and ammunition aside as soon as we had taken over the hut, and I left them with Ajor now, as I had noticed that aside from their hunting knives, the men of Kro lu bore no weapons about the village streets. There was an atmosphere of peace and security within that village that I had not hoped to experience within Caspak, and after what I had passed through, it must have cast a numbing spell over my faculties of judgment and reason. I had eaten of the lotus flower of safety. Dangers no longer threatened, for they had ceased to be. The messenger led me through the labyrinthine alleys to an open plaza near the center of the village. At one end of this plaza was a long hut, much the largest that I had yet seen, before the door of which were many warriors. I could see that the interior was lighted and that a great number of men were gathered within. The dogs about the plaza were as thick as fleas, and those I approached closely evinced a strong desire to devour me, their noses evidently apprising them of the fact that I was of an alien race, since they paid no attention whatever to my companion. Once inside the council hut, for such it appeared to be, I found a large concourse of warriors seated, or rather squatted, around the floor. At one end of the oval space which the warriors left down the center of the room stood Al tan and another warrior whom I immediately recognized as a Galu, and then I saw that there were many Galus present. About the walls were a number of flaming torches stuck in holes in a clay plaster, which evidently served the purpose of preventing the inflammable wood and grasses of which the hut was composed from being ignited by the flames. Lying about among the warriors, or wandering restlessly to and fro, were a number of savage dogs. The warriors eyed me curiously as I entered, especially the Galus, and then I was conducted into the center of the group and led forward toward Al tan. As I advanced, I felt one of the dogs sniffing at my heels, and of a sudden a great brute leaped upon my back. As I turned to thrust it aside before its fangs found a hold upon me, I beheld a huge Airedale leaping frantically about me. The grinning jaws, the half-closed eyes, the back-laid ears spoke to me louder than might the words of man that here was no savage enemy but a joyous friend, and then I recognized him, and fell to one knee and put my arms about his neck, while he whined and cried with joy. It was Nobs, dear old Nobs, Bowen Tyler's Nobs, who had loved me next to his master. "Where is the master of this dog?" I asked, turning toward Al tan. The chieftain inclined his head toward the Galu standing at his side. "He belongs to Du seen the Galu," he replied. "He belongs to Bowen J. Tyler, Jr., of Santa Monica," I retorted, "and I want to know where his master is." The Galu shrugged. "The dog is mine," he said. "He came to me cor sva jo, and he is unlike any dog in Caspak, being kind and docile and yet a killer when aroused. I would not part with him. I do not know the man of whom you speak." So this was Du seen. This was the man from whom Ajor had fled. I wondered if he knew that she was here. I wondered if they had sent for me because of her. But after they had commenced to question me, my mind was relieved. They did not mention Ajor. Their interest seemed centered upon the strange world from which I had come, my journey to Caspak, and my intentions now that I had arrived. I answered them frankly, as I had nothing to conceal, and assured them that my only wish was to find my friends and return to my own country. In the Galu Du seen and his warriors I saw something of the explanation of the term golden race which is applied to them, for their ornaments and weapons were either wholly of beaten gold or heavily decorated with the precious metal. They were a very imposing set of men, tall and straight and handsome. About their heads were bands of gold, like that which Ajor wore, and from their left shoulders depended the leopard tails of the Galus. In addition to the deerskin tunic which constituted the major portion of their apparel, each carried a light blanket of barbaric yet beautiful design, the first evidence of weaving I had seen in Caspak. Ajor had had no blanket, having lost it during her flight from the attentions of Du seen, nor was she so heavily encrusted with gold as these male members of her tribe. The audience must have lasted fully an hour when Al tan signified that I might return to my hut. All the time Nobs had lain quietly at my feet, but the instant that I turned to leave, he was up and after me. Du seen called to him, but the terrier never even so much as looked in his direction. I had almost reached the doorway leading from the council hall when Al tan rose and called after me. "Stop!" he shouted. "Stop, stranger! The beast of Du seen, the Galu, follows you." "The dog is not Du seen's," I replied. "He belongs to my friend, as I told you, and he prefers to stay with me until his master is found." And I turned again to resume my way. I had taken but a few steps when I heard a commotion behind me, and at the same moment a man leaned close and whispered "Kazar" close to my ear. Kazar, the Caspakian equivalent of beware. It was To-mar. As he spoke, he turned quickly away as though loath to have others see that he knew me, and at the same instant I wheeled to discover Du seen striding rapidly after me. Al tan followed him, and it was evident that both were angry. Du seen, a weapon half drawn, approached truculently. "The beast is mine," he reiterated. "Would you steal him?" "He is not yours nor mine," I replied, "and I am not stealing him. If he wishes to follow you, he may. I will not interfere; but if he wishes to follow me, he shall, nor shall you prevent." I turned to Al tan. "Is not that fair?" I demanded. "Let the dog choose his master." Du seen, without waiting for Al tan's reply, reached for Nobs and grasped him by the scruff of the neck. I did not interfere, for I guessed what would happen, and it did. With a savage growl, Nobs turned like lightning upon the Galu, wrenched loose from his hold and leaped for his throat. The man stepped back and warded off the first attack with a heavy blow of his fist, immediately drawing his knife with which to meet the Airedale's return. And Nobs would have returned all right had not I spoken to him. In a low voice I called to him to heel. For just an instant he hesitated, standing there trembling and with bared fangs glaring at his foe. But he was well trained and had been out with me quite as much as he had been with Bowen. In fact, I had had most to do with his early training. Then he walked slowly and very stiff-legged to his place behind me. Du-seen, red with rage, would have had it out with the two of us had not Al-tan drawn him to one side and whispered in his ear, upon which, with a grunt, the Galu walked straight back to the opposite end of the hall, while Nobs and I continued upon our way toward the hut and Ajor. As we passed out into the village plaza, I saw Chal-az. We were so close to one another that I could have reached out and touched him, and our eyes met; but though I greeted him pleasantly and paused to speak to him, he brushed past me without a sign of recognition. I was puzzled at his behavior, and then I recalled that To-mar, though he had warned me, had appeared not to wish to seem friendly with me. I could not understand their attitude, and was trying to puzzle out some sort of explanation, when the matter was suddenly driven from my mind by the report of a firearm. Instantly I broke into a run, my brain in a whirl of forebodings, for the only firearms in the Kro-lu country were those I had left in the hut with Ajor. That she was in danger I could not but fear, as she was now something of an adept in the handling of both the pistol and rifle, a fact which largely eliminated the chance that the shot had come from an accidentally discharged firearm. When I left the hut, I had felt that she and I were safe among friends. No thought of danger was in my mind; but since my audience with Al-tan, the presence and bearing of Du-seen and the strange attitude of both To-mar and Chal-az had each contributed toward arousing my suspicions, and now I ran along the narrow, winding alleys of the Kro-lu village with my heart fairly in my mouth. I am endowed with an excellent sense of direction, which has been greatly perfected by the years I have spent in the mountains and upon the plains and deserts of my native state, so that it was with little or no difficulty that I found my way back to the hut in which I had left Ajor. As I entered the doorway, I called her name aloud. There was no response. I drew a box of matches from my pocket and struck a light, and as the flame flared up, a half dozen brawny warriors leaped upon me from as many directions. But even in the brief instant that the flare lasted, I saw that Ajor was not within the hut, and that my arms and ammunition had been removed. As the six men leaped upon me, an angry growl burst from behind them. I had forgotten Nobs. Like a demon of hate he sprang among those Kro-lu fighting men, tearing, rending, ripping with his long tusks and his mighty jaws. They had me down in an instant, and it goes without saying that the six of them could have kept me there had it not been for Nobs. But while I was struggling to throw them off, Nobs was springing first upon one and then upon another of them, until they were so put to it to preserve their hides and their lives from him that they could give me only a small part of their attention. One of them was assiduously attempting to strike me on the head with his stone hatchet, but I caught his arm and at the same time turned over upon my belly, after which it took but an instant to get my feet under me and rise suddenly. As I did so, I kept a grip upon the man's arm, carrying it over one shoulder. Then I leaned suddenly forward and hurled my antagonist over my head to a hasty fall at the opposite side of the hut. In the dim light of the interior, I saw that Nobs had already accounted for one of the others, one who lay very quiet upon the floor, while the four remaining upon their feet were striking at him with knives and hatchets. Running to one side of the man I had just put out of the fighting, I seized his hatchet and knife, and in another moment was in the thick of the argument. I was no match for these savage warriors with their own weapons, and would soon have gone down to ignominious defeat and death had it not been for Nobs, who alone was a match for the four of them. I never saw any creature so quick upon its feet as was that great Airedale, nor such frightful ferocity as he manifested in his attacks. It was as much the latter as the former which contributed to the undoing of our enemies, who, accustomed though they were to the ferocity of terrible creatures, seemed awed by the sight of this strange beast from another world battling at the side of his equally strange master. Yet they were no cowards, and only by teamwork did Nobs and I overcome them at last. We would rush for a man simultaneously, and as Nobs leaped for him upon one side, I would strike at his head with the stone hatchet from the other. As the last man went down, I heard the running of many feet approaching us from the direction of the plaza. To be captured now would mean death, yet I could not attempt to leave the village without first ascertaining the whereabouts of Ajor and releasing her if she were held a captive. That I could escape the village I was not at all sure, But of one thing I was positive, that it would do neither Ajor nor myself any service to remain where I was and be captured; so with Nobs, bloody but happy, following at heel, I turned down the first alley and slunk away in the direction of the northern end of the village. Friendless and alone, hunted through the dark labyrinths of this savage community, I seldom have felt more helpless than at that moment. Yet far transcending any fear which I may have felt for my own safety was my concern for that of Ajor. What fate had befallen her? Where was she, and in whose power? That I should live to learn the answers to these queries I doubted, but that I should face death gladly in the attempt, of that I was certain. And why? With all my concern for the welfare of my friends who had accompanied me to Caprona, and of my best friend of all, Bowen Tyler, Jr., I never yet had experienced the almost paralyzing fear for the safety of any other creature which now threw me alternately into a fever of despair and into a cold sweat of apprehension as my mind dwelt upon the fate on one bit of half savage femininity of whose very existence even I had not dreamed a few short weeks before. What was this hold she had upon me? Was I bewitched that my mind refused to function sanely, and that judgment and reason were dethroned by some mad sentiment which I steadfastly refused to believe was love? I had never been in love. I was not in love now. The very thought was preposterous. How could I, Thomas Billings, the right hand man of the late Bowen Tyler, Sr., one of America's foremost captains of industry and the greatest man in California, be in love with the word stuck in my throat. Yet by my own American standards Ajor could be nothing else. At home, for all her beauty, for all her delicately tinted skin, little Ajor, by her apparel, by the habits and customs and manners of her people, by her life, would have been classed a squaw. Tom Billings in love with a squaw! I shuddered at the thought. And then there came to my mind, in a sudden brilliant flash upon the screen of recollection, the picture of Ajor as I had last seen her, and I lived again the delicious moment in which we had clung to one another, lips smothering lips, as I left her to go to the council hall of Al-tan, and I could have kicked myself for the snob and the cad that my thoughts had proven me who had always prided myself that I was neither the one nor the other. These things ran through my mind as Nobs and I made our way through the dark village, the voices and footsteps of those who sought us still in our ears. These and many other things, nor could I escape the incontrovertible fact that the little figure round which my recollections and my hopes entwined themselves was that of Ajor, beloved barbarian. My reveries were broken in upon by a hoarse whisper from the black interior of a hut past which we were making our way. My name was called in a low voice, and a man stepped out beside me as I halted with raised knife. It was Chal az. "Quick!" he warned. "In here. It is my hut, and they will not search it." I hesitated, recalled his attitude of a few minutes before, and as though he had read my thoughts, he said quickly, "I could not speak to you in the plaza without danger of arousing suspicions which would prevent me aiding you later, for word had gone out that Al-tan had turned against you and would destroy you. This was after Du-seen the Galu arrived." I followed him into the hut, and with Nobs at our heels, we passed through several chambers into a remote and windowless apartment where a small lamp sputtered in its unequal battle with the inky darkness. A hole in the roof permitted the smoke from burning oil egress, yet the atmosphere was far from lucid. Here Chal az motioned me to a seat upon a furry hide spread upon the earthen floor. "I am your friend," he said. "You saved my life, and I am no ingrate, as is the Batu Al-tan. I will serve you, and there are others here who will serve you against Al-tan and this renegade Galu, Du-seen." "But where is Ajor?" I asked, for I cared little for my own safety while she was in danger. "Ajor is safe too," he answered. "We learned the designs of Al-tan and Du-seen. The latter, learning that Ajor was here, demanded her, and Al-tan promised that he should have her; but when the warriors went to get her, To-mar went with them. Ajor tried to defend herself. She killed one of the warriors, and then Tomar picked her up in his arms when the others had taken her weapons from her. He told the others to look after the wounded man, who was really already dead, and to seize you upon your return, and that he, Tomar, would bear Ajor to Al-tan. But instead of bearing her to Al-tan, he took her to his own hut, where she now is with So-al, Tomar's she. It all happened very quickly. Tomar and I were in the council hut when Du-seen attempted to take the dog from you. I was seeking Tomar for this work. He ran out immediately and accompanied the warriors to your hut, while I remained to watch what went on within the council hut and to aid you if you needed aid. What has happened since, you know." I thanked him for his loyalty and then asked him to take me to Ajor, but he said that it could not be done, as the village streets were filled with searchers. In fact, we could hear them passing to and fro among the huts, making inquiries, and at last Chal-az thought it best to go to the doorway of his dwelling, which consisted of many huts joined together, lest they enter and search. Chal-az was absent for a long time, several hours which seemed an eternity to me. All sounds of pursuit had long since ceased, and I was becoming uneasy because of his protracted absence when I heard him returning through the other apartments of his dwelling. He was perturbed when he entered that in which I awaited him, and I saw a worried expression upon his face. "What is wrong?" I asked. "Have they found Ajor?" "No," he replied, "but Ajor has gone. She learned that you had escaped them and was told that you had left the village, believing that she had escaped too. So-al could not detain her. She made her way out over the top of the palisade, armed with only her knife." "Then I must go," I said, rising. Nobs rose and shook himself. He had been dead asleep when I spoke. "Yes," agreed Chal-az, "you must go at once. It is almost dawn. Du-seen leaves at daylight to search for her." He leaned close to my ear and whispered, "There are many to follow and help you. Al-tan has agreed to aid Du-seen against the Galus of Jor; but there are many of us who have combined to rise against Al-tan and prevent this ruthless desecration of the laws and customs of the Kro-lu and of Caspak. We will rise as Luata has ordained that we shall rise, and only thus. No Batu may win to the estate of a Galu by treachery and force of arms while Chal-az lives, and may wield a heavy blow and a sharp spear with true Kro-lus at his back." "I hope that I may live to aid you," I replied. "If I had my weapons and my ammunition, I could do much. Do you know where they are?" "No," he said. "They have disappeared." And then, "Wait. You cannot go forth half armed, and garbed as you are. You are going into the Galu country, and you must go as a Galu. Come." And without waiting for a reply, he led me into another apartment, or to be more explicit, another of the several huts which formed his cellular dwelling. Here was a pile of skins, weapons and ornaments. "Remove your strange apparel," said Chal-az, "and I will fit you out as a true Galu. I have slain several of them in the raids of my early days as a Kro-lu, and here are their trappings." I saw the wisdom of his suggestion, and as my clothes were by now so ragged as to but half conceal my nakedness, I had no regrets in laying them aside. Stripped to the skin, I donned the red deerskin tunic, the leopard tail, the golden fillet, armlets and leg ornaments of a Galu, with the belt, scabbard and knife, the shield, spear, bow and arrow, and the long rope, which I learned now for the first time is the distinctive weapon of the Galu warrior. It is a rawhide rope, not dissimilar to those of the western plains and cow camps of my youth. The honda is a golden oval and accurate weight for the throwing of the noose. This heavy honda, Chal-az explained, is used as a weapon, being thrown with great force and accuracy at an enemy and then coiled in for another cast. In hunting and in battle they use both the noose and the honda. If several warriors surround a single foeman or quarry, they rope it with the noose from several sides, but a single warrior against a lone antagonist will attempt to brain his foe with the metal oval. I could not have been more pleased with any weapon, short of a rifle, which he could have found for me, since I have been adept with the rope from early childhood. But I must confess that I was less favorably inclined toward my apparel. In so far as the sensation was concerned, I might as well have been entirely naked, so short and light was the tunic. When I asked Chal az for the Caspakian name for rope, he told me ga, and for the first time I understood the derivation of the word Galu, which means rope man. Entirely outfitted, I would not have known myself, so strange was my garb and my armament. Upon my back were slung my bow, arrows, shield, and short spear. From the center of my girdle depended my knife, at my right hip was my stone hatchet, and at my left hung the coils of my long rope. By reaching my right hand over my left shoulder, I could seize the spear or arrows. My left hand could find my bow over my right shoulder, while a veritable contortionist act was necessary to place my shield in front of me and upon my left arm. The shield, long and oval, is utilized more as a back armor than as a defense against frontal attack, for the close-set armlets of gold upon the left forearm are principally depended upon to ward off knife, spear, hatchet, or arrow from in front; but against the greater carnivora and the attacks of several human antagonists, the shield is utilized to its best advantage and carried by loops upon the left arm. Fully equipped except for a blanket, I followed Chal az from his domicile into the dark and deserted alleys of Kro lu. Silently we crept along, Nobs silent at heel, toward the nearest portion of the palisade. Here Chal az bade me farewell, telling me that he hoped to see me soon among the Galus, as he felt that the call soon would come to him. I thanked him for his loyal assistance and promised that whether I reached the Galu country or not, I should always stand ready to repay his kindness to me, and that he could count on me in the revolution against Al-Tan. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The People That Time Forgot. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. The People That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 7. To run up the inclined surface of the palisade and drop to the ground outside was the work of but a moment, or would have been but for Nobs. I had to put my rope about him after we reached the top, lift him over the sharpened stakes, and lower him upon the outside. To find Ajor in the unknown country to the north seemed rather hopeless, yet I could do no less than try, praying in the meanwhile that she would come through unscathed and in safety to her father. As Nobs and I swung along in the growing light of the coming day, I was impressed by the lessening numbers of savage beasts the farther north I traveled. With the decrease among the carnivora, the herbivora increased in quantity, though anywhere in Caspak they are sufficiently plentiful to furnish ample food for the meat eaters of each locality. The wild cattle, antelope, deer, and horses I passed showed changes in evolution from their cousins farther south. The kine were smaller and less shaggy, the horses larger. North of the Kro lu village I saw a small band of the latter, about the size of those of our old western plains, such as the Indians bred in former days, and to a lesser extent even now. They were fat and sleek, and I looked upon them with covetous eyes and with thoughts that any old cowpuncher may well imagine I might entertain after having hoofed it for weeks. But they were wary, scarce permitting me to approach within bow and arrow range, much less within roping distance. Yet I still had hopes which I never discarded. Twice before noon we were stalked and charged by man-eaters, but even though I was without firearms, I still had ample protection in Nobs, who evidently had learned something of Caspakian hunt rules under the tutelage of Du seen or some other Galu, and of course a great deal more by experience. He always was on the alert for dangerous foes, invariably warning me by low growls of the approach of a large carnivorous animal long before I could either see or hear it; and then when the thing appeared, he would run snapping at its heels, drawing the charge away from me until I found safety in some tree. Yet never did the wily Nobs take an unnecessary chance of a mauling. He would dart in and away so quickly that not even the lightning-like movements of the great cats could reach him. I have seen him tantalize them thus until they fairly screamed in rage. The greatest inconvenience the hunters caused me was the delay, for they have a nasty habit of keeping one treed for an hour or more if balked in their designs. But at last we came in sight of a line of cliffs running east and west across our path as far as the eye could see in either direction, and I knew that we reached the natural boundary which marks the line between the Kro Lu and Galu countries. The southern face of these cliffs loomed high and forbidding, rising to an altitude of some 200 feet, sheer and precipitous, without a break that the eye could perceive. How I was to find a crossing I could not guess. Whether to search to the east toward the still loftier barrier cliffs fronting upon the ocean, or westward in the direction of the inland sea, was a question which baffled me. Were there many passes or only one? I had no way of knowing. I could but trust to chance. It never occurred to me that Nobs had made the crossing at least once, possibly a greater number of times, and that he might lead me to the pass, and so it was with no idea of assistance that I appealed to him as a man alone with a dumb brute so often does. "Nobs," I said, "how the devil are we going to cross those cliffs?" I do not say that he understood me, even though I realize that an Airedale is a mighty intelligent dog; but I do swear that he seemed to understand me, for he wheeled about, barking joyously and trotting off toward the west, and when I didn't follow him, he ran back to me barking furiously, and at last taking hold of the calf of my leg in an effort to pull me along in the direction he wished me to go. Now, as my legs were naked and Nob's jaws are much more powerful than he realizes, I gave in and followed him, for I knew that I might as well go west as east, as far as any knowledge I had of the correct direction went. We followed the base of the cliffs for a considerable distance. The ground was rolling and tree dotted and covered with grazing animals, alone, in pairs, and in herds, a motley aggregation of the modern and extinct herbivore of the world. A huge woolly mastodon stood swaying to and fro in the shade of a giant fern, a mighty bull with enormous upcurving tusks. Near him grazed an aurochs bull with a cow and a calf. Close beside, a lone rhinoceros asleep in a dust hole. Deer, antelope, bison, horses, sheep, and goats were all in sight at the same time, and at a little distance a great megatherium reared up on its huge tail and massive hind feet to tear the leaves from a tall tree. The forgotten past rubbed flanks with the present, while Tom Billings, modern of the moderns, passed in the garb of pre-glacial man, and before him trotted a creature of a breed scarce 60 years old. Nobs was a parvenu, but it failed to worry him. As we neared the inland sea, we saw more flying reptiles and several great amphibians, but none of them attacked us. As we were topping a rise in the middle of the afternoon, I saw something that brought me to a sudden stop. Calling Nobs in a whisper, I cautioned him to silence, and kept him at heel while I threw myself flat and watched from behind a sheltering shrub a body of warriors approaching the cliff from the south. I could see that they were Galus, and I guessed that Du seen led them. They had taken a shorter route to the pass and so had overhauled me. I could see them plainly, for they were no great distance away, and saw with relief that Ajor was not with them. The cliffs before them were broken and ragged, those coming from the east overlapping the cliffs from the west. Into the defile formed by this overlapping the party filed. I could see them climbing upward for a few minutes, and then they disappeared from view. When the last of them had passed from sight, I rose and bent my steps in the direction of the pass, the same pass toward which Nobs had evidently been leading me. I went warily as I approached it, for fear the party might have halted to rest. If they hadn't halted, I had no fear of being discovered, for I had seen that the Galus marched without point, flankers, or rear guard. And when I reached the pass and saw a narrow one-man trail leading upward at a stiff angle, I wished that I were chief of the Galus for a few weeks. A dozen men could hold off forever in that narrow pass all the hordes which might be brought up from the south, yet there it lay entirely unguarded. The Galus might be a great people in Caspak, but they were pitifully inefficient in even the simpler forms of military tactics. I was surprised that even a man in the Stone Age should be so lacking in military perspicacity. Du seen dropped far below par in my estimation as I saw the slovenly formation of his troop as it passed through an enemy country and entered the domain of the chief against whom he had risen in revolt. But Du seen must have known Jor the chief and known that Jor would not be waiting for him at the pass. Nevertheless, he took unwarranted chances. With one squad of a home guard company I could have conquered Caspak. Nobs and I followed to the summit of the pass, and there we saw the party defiling into the Galu country, the level of which was not, on an average, over 50 feet below the summit of the cliffs and about 150 feet above the adjacent Kro lu domain. Immediately the landscape changed. The trees, the flowers, and the shrubs were of a hardier type, and I realized that at night the Galu blanket might be almost a necessity. Acacia and eucalyptus predominated among the trees, yet there were ash and oak and even pine and fir and hemlock. The tree life was riotous. The forests were dense and peopled by enormous trees. From the summit of the cliff I could see forests rising hundreds of feet above the level upon which I stood, and even at the distance they were from me I realized that the boles were of gigantic size. At last I had come to the Galu country. Though not conceived in Caspak, I indeed come up Korsvajo. From the beginning I had come up through the hideous horrors of the lower Caspakian spheres of evolution, and I could not but feel something of the elation and pride which had filled Tomar and So al when they realized that the call had come to them and they were about to rise from the estate of Band lus to that of Kro lus. I was glad that I was not Batu. But where was Ajor? Though my eyes searched the wide landscape before me, I saw nothing other than the warriors of Du seen and the beasts of the fields and the forests. Surrounded by forests, I could see wide plains dotting the country as far as the eye could reach, but nowhere was a sign of a small Galu she, the beloved she whom I would have given my right hand to see. Nobs and I were hungry. We had not eaten since the preceding night, and below us was game deer, sheep, anything that a hungry hunter might crave. So down the steep trail we made our way, and then upon my belly, with Nobs crouching low behind me, I crawled toward a small herd of red deer feeding at the edge of a plain, close beside a forest. There was ample cover, what with solitary trees and dotting bushes, so that I found no difficulty in stalking upwind to within 50 feet of my quarry, a large, sleek doe unaccompanied by a fawn. Greatly then did I regret my rifle. Never in my life had I shot an arrow, but I knew how it was done, and fitting the shaft to my string, I aimed carefully and let drive. At the same instant I called to Nobs and leaped to my feet. The arrow caught the doe full in the side, and in the same moment Nobs was after her. She turned to flee with the two of us pursuing her, Nobs with his great fangs bared and I with my short spear poised for a cast. The balance of the herd sprang quickly away, but the hurt doe lagged, and in a moment Nobs was beside her and had leaped at her throat. He had her down when I came up, and I finished her with my spear. It didn't take me long to have a fire going and a steak broiling, and while I was preparing for my own feast, Nobs was filling himself with raw venison. Never have I enjoyed a meal so heartily. For 2 days I searched fruitlessly back and forth from the inland sea almost to the barrier cliffs for some trace of Ajor, and always I trended northward; but I saw no sign of any human being, not even the band of Galu warriors under Du seen. And then I commenced to have misgivings. Had Chal az spoken the truth to me when he said that Ajor had quit the village of the Kro lu? Might he not have been acting upon the orders of Al tan, in whose savage bosom might have lurked some small spark of shame that he had attempted to do to death one who had befriended a Kro lu warrior, a guest who had brought no harm upon the Kro lu race, and thus have sent me out upon a fruitless mission in the hope that the wild beast would do what Al tan hesitated to do? I did not know, but the more I thought upon it, the more convinced I became that Ajor had not quitted the Kro lu village. But if not, what had brought Du seen forth without her? There was a puzzler, and once again I was all at sea. On the second day of my experience of the Galu country, I came upon a bunch of as magnificent horses as it has ever been my lot to see. They were dark bays with blazed faces and perfect surcingles of white about their barrels. Their forelegs were white to the knees. In height they stood almost 16 hands, the mares being a trifle smaller than the stallions, of which there were 3 or 4 in this band of 100, which comprised many colts and half-grown horses. Their markings were almost identical, indicating a purity of strain that might have persisted since long ages ago. If I had coveted one of the little ponies of the Kro Lu country, imagine my state of mind when I came upon these magnificent creatures. No sooner had I espied them than I determined to possess one of them, nor did it take me long to select a beautiful young stallion, a 4-year-old I guessed him. The horses were grazing close to the edge of the forest in which Nobs and I were concealed, while the ground between us and them was dotted with clumps of flowering brush which offered perfect concealment. The stallion of my choice grazed with a filly and 2 yearlings a little apart from the balance of the herd and nearest to the forest and to me. At my whispered "Charge!" Nobs flattened himself to the ground, and I knew that he would not again move until I called him, unless danger threatened me from the rear. Carefully I crept forward toward my unsuspecting quarry, coming undetected to the concealment of a bush not more than 20 feet from him. Here I quietly arranged my noose, spreading it flat and open upon the ground. To step to one side of the bush and throw directly from the ground, which is the style I am best in, would take but an instant, and in that instant the stallion would doubtless be under way at top speed in the opposite direction. Then he would have to wheel about when I surprised him, and in doing so he would most certainly rise slightly upon his hind feet and throw up his head, presenting a perfect target for my noose as he pivoted. Yes, I had it beautifully worked out, and I waited until he should turn in my direction. At last it became evident that he was doing so, when apparently without cause the filly raised her head, neighed, and started off at a trot in the opposite direction, immediately followed of course by the colts and my stallion. It looked for a moment as though my last hope was blasted, but presently their fright, if fright it was, passed, and they resumed grazing again 100 yards farther on. This time there was no bush within 50 feet of them, and I was at a loss as to how to get within safe roping distance. Anywhere under 40 feet I am an excellent roper; at 50 feet I am fair, but over that I knew it would be a matter of luck if I succeeded in getting my noose about that beautiful arched neck. As I stood debating the question in my mind, I was almost upon the point of making the attempt at the long throw. I had plenty of rope, this Galu weapon being fully 60 feet long. How I wished for the collies from the ranch! At a word they would have circled this little bunch and driven it straight down to me, and then it flashed into my mind that Nobs had run with those collies all one summer, that he had gone down to the pasture with them after the cows every evening, and done his part in driving them back to the milking barn, and had done it intelligently. But Nobs had never done the thing alone, and it had been a year since he had done it at all. However, the chances were more in favor of my foozling the long throw than that Nobs would fall down in his part if I gave him the chance. Having come to a decision, I had to creep back to Nobs and get him, and then with him at my heels return to a large bush near the 4 horses. Here we could see directly through the bush, and pointing the animals out to Nobs, I whispered, "Fetch 'em, boy." In an instant he was gone, circling wide toward the rear of the quarry. They caught sight of him almost immediately and broke into a trot away from him, but when they saw that he was apparently giving them a wide berth, they stopped again, though they stood watching him with high-held heads and quivering nostrils. It was a beautiful sight, and then Nobs turned in behind them and trotted slowly back toward me. He did not bark nor come rushing down upon them, and when he had come closer to them, he proceeded at a walk. The splendid creatures seemed more curious than fearful, making no effort to escape until Nobs was quite close to them. Then they trotted slowly away, but at right angles. And now the fun and trouble commenced. Nobs, of course, attempted to turn them, and he seemed to have selected the stallion to work upon, for he paid no attention to the others, having intelligence enough to know that a lone dog could run his legs off before he could round up four horses that didn't wish to be rounded up. The stallion, however, had notions of his own about being headed, and the result was as pretty a race as one could care to see. Gad, how that horse could run! He seemed to flatten out and shoot through the air with the very minimum of exertion, and at his forefoot ran Nobs, doing his best to turn him. He was barking now, and twice he leaped high against the stallion's flank, but this cost too much effort and always lost him ground, as each time he was hurled heels overhead by the impact. Yet before they disappeared over a rise in the ground, I was sure that Nob's persistence was bearing fruit. It seemed to me that the horse was giving way a trifle to the right. Nobs was between him and the main herd, to which the yearling and filly had already fled. As I stood waiting for Nob's return, I could not but speculate upon my chances should I be attacked by some formidable beast. I was some distance from the forest, and armed with weapons in the use of which I was quite untrained, though I had practiced some with the spear since leaving the Kro Lu country. I must admit that my thoughts were not pleasant ones, verging almost upon cowardice, until I chanced to think of little Ajor alone in this same land and armed only with a knife. I was immediately filled with shame. But in thinking the matter over since, I have come to the conclusion that my state of mind was influenced largely by my approximate nakedness. If you have never wandered about in broad daylight garbed in a bit of red deerskin in inadequate length, you can have no conception of the sensation of futility that overwhelms one. Clothes, to a man accustomed to wearing clothes, impart a certain self-confidence; lack of them induces panic. But no beast attacked me, though I saw several menacing forms passing through the dark aisles of the forest. At last I commenced to worry over Nob's protracted absence and to fear that something had befallen him. I was coiling my rope to start out in search of him when I saw the stallion leap into view at almost the same spot behind which he had disappeared, and at his heels ran Nobs. Neither was running so fast or furiously as when last I had seen them. The horse, as he approached me, I could see was laboring hard, yet he kept gamely to his task, and Nobs too. The splendid fellow was driving the quarry straight toward me. I crouched behind my bush and laid my noose in readiness to throw. As the two approached my hiding place, Nobs reduced his speed, and the stallion, evidently only too glad of the respite, dropped into a trot. It was at this gait that he passed me. My rope hand flew forward, the honda well down, held the noose open, and the beautiful bay fairly ran his head into it. Instantly he wheeled to dash off at right angles. I braced myself with the rope around my hip and brought him to a sudden stand. Rearing and struggling, he fought for his liberty, while Nobs, panting and with lolling tongue, came and threw himself down near me. He seemed to know that his work was done and that he had earned his rest. The stallion was pretty well spent, and after a few minutes of struggling, he stood with feet far spread, nostrils dilated and eyes wide, watching me as I edged toward him, taking in the slack of the rope as I advanced. A dozen times he reared and tried to break away, but always I spoke soothingly to him, and after an hour of effort I succeeded in reaching his head and stroking his muzzle. Then I gathered a handful of grass and offered it to him, and always I talked to him in a quiet and reassuring voice. I had expected a battle royal, but on the contrary I found his taming a matter of comparative ease. Though wild, he was gentle to a degree, and of such remarkable intelligence that he soon discovered that I had no intention of harming him. After that, all was easy. Before that day was done, I had taught him to lead and to stand while I stroked his head and flanks, and to eat from my hand, and had the satisfaction of seeing the light of fear die in his large, intelligent eyes. The following day I fashioned a hackamore from a piece which I cut from the end of my long Galu rope, and then I mounted him fully prepared for a struggle of titanic proportions in which I was none too sure that he would not come off victor. But he never made the slightest effort to unseat me, and from then on his education was rapid. No horse ever learned more quickly the meaning of the rein and the pressure of the knees. I think he soon learned to love me, and I know that I loved him, while he and Nobs were the best of pals. I called him Ace. I had a friend who was once in the French Flying Corps, and when Ace let himself out, he certainly flew. I cannot explain to you, nor can you understand unless you too are a horseman, the exhilarating feeling of well being which pervaded me from the moment that I commenced riding Ace. I was a new man, imbued with a sense of superiority that led me to feel that I could go forth and conquer all Caspak single handed. Now when I needed meat, I ran it down on Ace and roped it, and when some great beast with which we could not cope threatened us, we galloped away to safety. But for the most part the creatures we met looked upon us in terror, for Ace and I in combination presented a new and unusual beast beyond their experience and ken. For 5 days I rode back and forth across the southern end of the Galu country without seeing a human being, yet all the time I was working slowly toward the north, for I had determined to comb the territory thoroughly in search of Ajor. But on the 5th day, as I emerged from a forest, I saw some distance ahead of me a single small figure pursued by many others. Instantly I recognized the quarry as Ajor. The entire party was fully a mile away from me, and they were crossing my path at right angles, Ajor a few hundred yards in advance of those who followed her. One of her pursuers was far in advance of the others and was gaining upon her rapidly. With a word and a pressure of the knees, I sent Ace leaping out into the open, and with Nobs running close alongside, we raced toward her. At first none of them saw us, but as we neared Ajor, the pack behind the foremost pursuer discovered us and set up such a howl as I never before have heard. They were all Galus, and I soon recognized the foremost as Du seen. He was almost upon Ajor now, and with a sense of terror such as I had never before experienced, I saw that he ran with his knife in his hand, and that his intention was to slay rather than capture. I could not understand it, but I could only urge Ace to greater speed, and most nobly did the wondrous creature respond to my demands. If ever a four-footed creature approximated flying, it was Ace that day. Du seen, intent upon his brutal design, had as yet not noticed us. He was within a pace of Ajor when Ace and I dashed between them, and I, leaning down to the left, swept my little barbarian into the hollow of an arm and up on the withers of my glorious Ace. We had snatched her from the very clutches of Du seen, who halted, mystified and raging. Ajor too was mystified, as we had come up from diagonally behind her, so that she had no idea that we were near until she was swung to Ace's back. The little savage turned with drawn knife to stab me, thinking that I was some new enemy, when her eyes found my face and she recognized me. With a little sob she threw her arms about my neck, gasping, "My Tom! My Tom!" And then Ace sank suddenly into thick mud to his belly, and Ajor and I were thrown far over his head. He had run into one of those numerous springs which cover Caspak. Sometimes they are little lakes, again but tiny pools, and often more quagmires of mud, as was this one, overgrown with lush grasses which effectually hid its treacherous identity. It is a wonder that Ace did not break a leg, so fast he was going when he fell; but he didn't, though with 4 good legs he was unable to wallow from the mire. Ajor and I had sprawled face down in the covering grasses, and so had not sunk deeply, but when we tried to rise, we found that there was not footing, and presently we saw that Du seen and his followers were coming down upon us. There was no escape. It was evident that we were doomed. "Slay me," begged Ajor. "Let me die at thy loved hands, rather than beneath the knife of this hateful thing, for he will kill me. He has sworn to kill me. Last night he captured me, and when later he would have his way with me, I struck him with my fists and with my knife. I stabbed him, and then I escaped, leaving him raging in pain and thwarted desire. Today they searched for me and found me, and as I fled, Du seen ran after me, crying that he would slay me. Kill me, my Tom, and then fall upon thine own spear, for they will kill you horribly if they take you alive." I couldn't kill her. not at least until the last moment, and I told her so, and that I loved her, and that until death came I would live and fight for her. Nobs had followed us into the bog and had done fairly well at first, but when he neared us, he too sank to his belly and could only flounder about. We were in this predicament when Du seen and his followers approached the edge of the horrible swamp. I saw that Al tan was with him and many other Kro lu warriors. The alliance against Jor the chief had therefore been consummated, and this horde was already marching upon the Galu city. I sighed as I thought how close I had been to saving not only Ajor but her father and his people from defeat and death. Beyond the swamp was a dense wood. Could we have reached this, we would have been safe, but it might as well have been 100 miles away as 100 yards across that hidden lake of sticky mud. Upon the edge of the swamp Du seen and his horde halted to revile us. They could not reach us with their hands, but at a command from Du seen they fitted arrows to their bows, and I saw that the end had come. Ajor huddled close to me, and I took her in my arms. "I love you, Tom," she said. "Only you." Tears came to my eyes then, not tears of self-pity for my predicament, but tears from a heart filled with a great love, a heart that sees the sun of its life and its love setting even as it rises. The renegade Galus and their Kro lu allies stood waiting for the word from Du seen that would launch that barbed avalanche of death upon us, when there broke from the wood beyond the swamp the sweetest music that ever fell upon the ears of man, the sharp staccato of at least 20 rifles fired rapidly at will. Down went the Galu and Kro lu warriors like tenpins before that deadly fusillade. What could it mean? To me it meant but one thing, and that was that Hollis and Short and the others had scaled the cliffs and made their way north to the Galu country upon the opposite side of the island in time to save Ajor and me from almost certain death. I didn't have to have an introduction to them to know that the men who held those rifles were the men of my own party, and when a few minutes later they came forth from their concealment, my eyes verified my hopes. There they were, every man jack of them, and with them were 1,000 straight, sleek warriors of the Galu race, and ahead of the others came 2 men in the garb of Galus. Each was tall and straight and wonderfully muscled, yet they differed as Ace might differ from a perfect specimen of another species. As they approached the mire, Ajor held forth her arms and cried, "Jor, my chief, my father!" and the elder of the two rushed in knee deep to rescue her. And then the other came close and looked into my face, and his eyes went wide, and mine too, and I cried, "Bowen! For heaven's sake, Bowen Tyler!" It was he! My search was ended. Around me were all my company and the man we had searched a new world to find. They cut saplings from the forest and laid a road into the swamp before they could get us all out, and then we marched back to the city of Jor the Galu chief, and there was great rejoicing when Ajor came home again, mounted upon the glossy back of the stallion Ace. Tyler and Hollis and Short and all the rest of us Americans nearly worked our jaws loose on the march back to the village, and for days afterward we kept it up. They told me how they had crossed the barrier cliffs in 5 days, working 24 hours a day in 3 8-hour shifts, with 2 reliefs to each shift alternating half-hourly. 2 men with electric drills driven from the dynamos aboard the Toreador drilled 2 holes 4 feet apart in the face of the cliff and in the same horizontal planes. The holes slanted slightly downward. Into these holes the iron rods brought as a part of our equipment, and for just this purpose, were inserted, extending about a foot beyond the face of the rock. Across these 2 rods a plank was laid, and then the next shift, mounting to the new level, bored 2 more holes 5 feet above the new platform, and so on. During the nights the searchlights from the Toreador were kept playing upon the cliff at the point where the drills were working, and at the rate of 10 feet an hour the summit was reached upon the 5th day. Ropes were lowered, blocks lashed to trees at the top, and crude elevators rigged, so that by the night of the fifth day the entire party, with the exception of the few men needed to man the Toreador, were within Caspak, with an abundance of arms, ammunition, and equipment. From then on they fought their way north in search of me, after a vain and perilous effort to enter the hideous reptile-infested country to the south. Owing to the number of guns among them, they had not lost a man, but their path was strewn with the dead creatures they had been forced to slay to win their way to the north end of the island, where they had found Bowen and his bride among the Galus of Jor. The reunion between Bowen and Nobs was marked by a frantic display upon Nobs' part, which almost stripped Bowen of the scanty attire that the Galu custom had vouchsafed him. When we arrived at the Galu city, Lys La Rue was waiting to welcome us. She was Mrs. Tyler now, as the master of the Toreador had married them the very day that the search party had found them, though neither Lys nor Bowen would admit that any civil or religious ceremony could have rendered more sacred the bonds with which God had united them. Neither Bowen nor the party from the Toreador had seen any sign of Bradley and his party. They had been so long lost now that any hopes for them must be definitely abandoned. The Galus had heard rumors of them, as had the western Kro lu and Band lu, but none had seen aught of them since they had left Fort Dinosaur months since. We rested in Jor's village for a fortnight while we prepared for the southward journey to the point where the Toreador was to lie offshore in wait for us. During these 2 weeks Chal az came up from the Kro lu country, now a full-fledged Galu. He told us that the remnants of Al tan's party had been slain when they attempted to re-enter Kro lu. Chal az had been made chief, and when he rose, had left the tribe under a new leader whom all respected. Nobs stuck close to Bowen, but Ace and Ajor and I went out upon many long rides through the beautiful North Galu country. Chal az had brought my arms and ammunition up from Kro lu with him, but my clothes were gone, nor did I miss them once I became accustomed to the free attire of the Galu. At last came the time for our departure. Upon the following morning we were to set out toward the south and the Toreador and dear old California. I had asked Ajor to go with us, but Jor, her father, had refused to listen to the suggestion. No pleas could swerve him from his decision. Ajor the cos ata lo, from whom might spring a new and greater Caspakian race, could not be spared. I might have any other she among the Galus, but Ajor, no. The poor child was heartbroken, and as for me, I was slowly realizing the hold that Ajor had upon my heart, and wondered how I should get along without her. As I held her in my arms that last night, I tried to imagine what life would be like without her, for at last there had come to me the realization that I loved her, loved my little barbarian, and as I finally tore myself away and went to my own hut to snatch a few hours' sleep before we set off upon our long journey on the morrow, I consoled myself with the thought that time would heal the wound, and that back in my native land I should find a mate who would be all and more to me than little Ajor could ever be, a woman of my own race and my own culture. Morning came more quickly than I could have wished. I rose and breakfasted, but saw nothing of Ajor. It was best, I thought, that I go thus without the harrowing pangs of a last farewell. The party formed for the march, an escort of Galu warriors ready to accompany us. I could not even bear to go to Ace's corral and bid him farewell. The night before I had given him to Ajor, and now in my mind the two seemed inseparable. And so we marched away, down the street flanked with its stone houses, and out through the wide gateway in the stone wall which surrounds the city, and on across the clearing toward the forest through which we must pass to reach the northern boundary of Galu, beyond which we would turn south. At the edge of the forest I cast a backward glance at the city which held my heart, and beside the massive gateway I saw that which brought me to a sudden halt. It was a little figure leaning against one of the great upright posts upon which the gates swing, a crumpled little figure, and even at this distance I could see its shoulders heave to the sobs that racked it. It was the last straw. Bowen was near me. "Good bye, old man," I said. "I'm going back." He looked at me in surprise. "Good bye, old man," he said, and grasped my hand. "I thought you'd do it in the end." And then I went back and took Ajor in my arms and kissed the tears from her eyes and a smile to her lips, while together we watched the last of the Americans disappear into the forest. Chapter 8. End of The People That Time Forgot.